Tonight, picture a hillside above a wide blue sea. It is late afternoon in the eastern Mediterranean, on a coast of grey rock and silver-green olive trees, and the light is beginning to turn the colour of honey. Below the hill the water lies almost still, a deep wine dark blue near the shore, and paler out toward the islands, and there are islands everywhere, dozens of them, hundreds of them, low humps of stone scattered across the sea like the backs of sleeping animals, each one holding its own little world of goats and vines and small white houses. The air is warm and dry and smells of wild thyme crushed underfoot, of salt lifting off the water, of wood smoke from a fire somewhere down in the folds of the land. A goatherd is sitting on a rock with a stick across his knees, doing nothing in particular, watching the sea the way people have watched this sea for thousands of years. A fishing boat is coming in with its single square sail slack, the oars dipping and lifting, leaving little rings of light on the water. On the hilltop behind him there are the fallen stones of something very old. A wall, a gateway, a scatter of worked marble half buried in the grass. And the goatherd does not think about them at all, because they have always been there, the way the mountains have always been there, and the sea has always been there. And yet from this coast, from these islands, from these small stony hills that can barely feed the people who live on them, there came something that would shape the mind of the whole world, an idea of how to think, and how to argue, and how to govern, and how to build, and how to tell a story. An inheritance so deep that even now, thousands of years later, we still walk around inside it, without noticing, the way the goatherd sits among the fallen marble without noticing. Tonight we are going to follow the whole of that long story, slowly and gently, from the very first palaces of the Bronze Age to the strange bright empire of a young Macedonian king who wept, they said, because there were no more worlds to conquer. It is a story of nearly 2,000 years, and we have all the time in the world, because there is nowhere to be and nothing to do but let it unfold. So settle now into whatever stillness you have made for yourself tonight. Let the lamp grow dim. Let the day you have had, whatever it held, whatever it cost you, slip down off your shoulders one quiet inch at a time, the way a heavy coat slips from a chair. There is nothing left tonight that needs deciding. There is nothing left that needs carrying. If you enjoy these slow journeys through the past, and only if you truly do, you might let the video know with a quiet like, and perhaps follow along so the next one can find you on some other sleepless night. And if you feel like it, leave your town and your local time down in the comments before you drift off, because there is something gentle in knowing that all across the world, in 100 different midnights, other people are lying in the dark and listening to the very same story, and it helps other restless souls find their way to this quiet corner. But there is no hurry even for that. Let your breathing slow. Let your eyes grow heavy whenever they wish to, and let us begin, as all of this began, long before there was anything you could call Greece at all. Because that is the first thing to understand, lying here in the dark. There was no Greece, not as a country, not as a state, not as a single people under a single crown, for almost the entire span of the story we are about to tell. The word we use, Greece, is a Roman word, given much later by outsiders. The people themselves, when at last they had a name for what they shared, called it Hellas, and called themselves Hellenes, and it was never a nation with a capital and a king. It was something much looser and stranger than that, a scattering of little independent towns and their farmlands, each one fiercely proud. Each one certain that its own way of doing things was the only sensible way. Each one ready to go to war with the town over the next range of hills, over an old insult or a strip of border pasture. What held them together was not a government. It was a language, more or less shared, with many dialects. It was a set of gods whose stories everyone knew. It was a handful of holy places they all travelled to, and a handful of games they all competed in, and a deep shared sense, difficult to put into words, that they were all Hellenes and everyone else in the world was something else. something they rather rudely lumped together under a single word for the babble of foreign speech that sounded to their ears like bar bar bar, from which we still get our word for barbarian. But all of that lies far ahead of us. To begin at the true beginning, we must go back to the land itself, and to the sea, because in this story the land and the sea shape everything that the people become. Imagine then the shape of this country. It hangs down into the Mediterranean like a ragged hand with too many fingers. A peninsula at the bottom of the Balkans, and it is a hard land, a thin land, more rock than soil. Mountains run through it in every direction, steep and grey and dividing the country into 1,000 small pockets, little plains and sheltered valleys walled off from one another by high ridges that are difficult to cross. There are almost no great rivers, nothing like the mighty Nile of Egypt or the broad Euphrates of Mesopotamia, no single life-giving flood to bind a whole people together under one authority. Instead, there are these separated valleys, each just large enough to feed a small community, each cut off enough to grow its own stubborn independence. It is a landscape that seems designed to produce not one great kingdom, but hundreds of small ones, and that is exactly what it did. And then there is the sea, folded deep into the land on every side, reaching up into it with long bays and gulfs, so that almost nowhere in Greece is very far from salt water, and studded all across with those countless islands. Near enough to one another that a small boat could hop from one to the next, island to island, all the way across the Aegean to the coast of Asia. If the mountains divided the Greeks, the sea connected them, and it connected them to everyone else as well, to Egypt and to the Levant, to Italy and to the shores of the Black Sea. It made them sailors and traders, and when it suited them, pirates. It carried their olive oil and their painted pots to distant markets, and brought back grain and metal and ideas. The sea was their road, their fortune and their danger, and for a people packed onto a poor and stony land, it was very often the difference between a full belly and an empty one. Hold all of that in your mind as you lie there, the grey mountains and the wine-dark sea and the scattered islands, because everything that follows grows out of that geography as surely as the olive tree grows out of the thin dry ground. And now let us go back, very far back, further than the Gothard on the hill could ever imagine, to a time when the first great civilization of these seas was not on the mainland at all, but on a long green island lying across the mouth of the Aegean like a drawn bar, an island called Crete. Crete is the largest of all the Greek islands, a long spine of mountains rising straight out of the sea, with narrow green plains along its northern edge, where the land runs down gently to good harbours. And here, more than 4,000 years ago, while the pharaohs were already building in Egypt and the cities of Mesopotamia were already old, there grew up the first true civilization of Europe, a civilization we now call Minoan, after a legendary king named Minos, who was said to have ruled from the island long ago. They did not call themselves Minoan, of course. We do not know what they called themselves, because although they wrote, in a looping script we call Linear A, no one alive can read it, and so their voices are lost to us, and we know them only by the things they left in the ground. But what things they left? Around 4,000 years ago, on Crete, people began to build palaces, and these were not palaces in the sense of a single grand house for a king. They were enormous, sprawling complexes, hundreds upon hundreds of rooms wrapped around a great central courtyard, rising several stories high, with wide staircases and columns painted red that grew wider at the top than the bottom, with storerooms and workshops and shrines and living quarters all knitted together into a single vast building that grew and grew over the centuries until it was almost a town under one roof. The greatest of them was at a place called Knossos, near the northern coast, and when its ruins were dug out of the earth a little over 100 years ago, the people who uncovered it could hardly believe the sophistication of what they found. There were bathrooms with clay tubs, there were drains and clay pipes carrying water and waste, a system of plumbing that would not be matched in Europe again for thousands of years. There were storerooms lined with great pottery jars taller than a man, jars called pitoi, row upon row of them, once filled with olive oil and wine and grain, the wealth of the island gathered in and counted and kept. And there were the paintings. On the plastered walls the Minuans painted a world of astonishing lightness and grace, a world of blue dolphins leaping through the water, of ladies with elaborate curled black hair and bright layered dresses talking and laughing at some festival, of lilies and crocuses and running spirals, of young men slender as reeds walking through fields of flowers. There is almost no war in Minuan art. There are almost no kings shown crushing their enemies. None of the grim boasting that fills the art of Egypt and the Near East. Instead there is the sea, and there are flowers, and there is above all a strange and thrilling ceremony that they painted again and again, the leaping of the bulls. A great bull charges forward, and a slim young acrobat takes hold of its horns and vaults up and over, turning a somersault along the length of the animal's back to land on their feet behind it, while others stand ready to catch. Whether this was a sport, a religious rite, a test of courage, or all three at once, we do not know. But the bull runs all through the Minuan world, its horns carved in stone along the tops of the palace walls, and it runs into the later Greek imagination too, into the dark and famous story that the Greeks themselves would tell about Crete, the story of the Minotaur. For the Greeks of later ages remembered Crete as a place of ancient power and dread. They told how King Minos had kept a monster, half man and half bull, in a maze beneath his palace, a maze so cunning that no one who entered it could ever find the way out, and how every few years the city of Athens had been forced to send 7 young men and 7 young women as tribute, to be turned loose in the maze and devoured, until at last a hero named Theseus went in with a ball of thread to mark his path, killed the monster in the dark, and followed the thread back out to the light. It is only a story. But like many stories, it has a shape of truth folded inside it, the dim memory of a time when the mainland Greeks were poor and weak, and the lords of Crete were rich and powerful and demanded tribute from across the sea, when the sprawling many-roomed palace at Knossos, with its endless winding corridors, might well have seemed to a frightened visitor from a simpler place, very like a labyrinth, from which one could never escape. The Minuans were sailors above all. They were the first great sea power of these waters, what later writers would call a thalassocracy, a rule of the sea, and their ships carried Cretan goods to Egypt and to the coast of the Levant, and up into the Aegean islands and beyond. They did not need thick walls around their palaces, and this is one of the most striking things about them, for the great Minoan palaces were unfortified, open without towers or ramparts, as if their builders felt no fear of attack. And perhaps for a long time they had no reason to. Their navy was their wall, the sea was their moat. As long as they ruled the waves, no enemy could come at them, and they lived, it seems, in a long, confident summer of prosperity, trading and building and painting their dolphins and their lilies, for the better part of 1,000 years. But the world of the Bronze Age was a fragile thing, more fragile than it looked, and Crete sat in a dangerous place, for the whole eastern Mediterranean is a restless country underneath, a place where the plates of the earth grind against one another, and the ground itself is never quite still. Somewhere around the middle of this long story, on the small island of Thera, a short sail north of Crete, one of the largest volcanic eruptions in all of human history tore the island apart. The whole centre of Thera collapsed into the sea in a single catastrophe, throwing up a column of ash miles into the sky, blotting out the sun, and sending out across the water a wall of sea, a tsunami, that would have fallen on the northern coast of Crete, where the harbours and the fleet and much of the wealth of the Minoans lay. We do not know exactly how heavy the blow was, or how quickly the Minuans recovered from it, and scholars still argue about the dates and the details. But something changed after Thera. The confidence seems to go out of the Minuan world. And into that moment of weakness, from across the water to the north, from the rugged mainland of Greece itself, came a harder and hungrier people, and it is to them that we now must turn, because they are the first people in this story who can truly be called Greek. Let your thoughts drift north then, away from the flowers of Crete, up to the dry grey hills of the mainland, to a fortress of huge grey stones on a rocky height, looking out over a plain toward the sea. This is Mycenae, and it gives its name to the whole age that follows, the Mycenaean Age, the age of the first Greek-speaking lords. The Mycenaeans were a different sort of people from the flower-painting Minoans, though they learned a great deal from them. Where the Minoans built open unwalled palaces and painted dolphins, the Mycenaeans built fortresses, grim and massive, on high defensible hills, and ringed them with walls of such enormous stones that the later Greeks, gazing up at them, could not believe that human hands had raised them, and decided instead that they must have been built by the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants of legend, and so we still call that style of building Cyclopean to this day. At Mycenae itself, the great gateway into the citadel is crowned by two carved lionesses standing on either side of a column, the oldest monumental sculpture in Europe, and it still stands there now, after more than 3,000 years, looking down the same slope it has always looked down. These lords loved gold. When their royal graves were opened in more recent times, the diggers found the dead kings laid out with faces covered in masks of beaten gold, buried with swords and daggers inlaid with hunting scenes in gold and silver, with cups and diadems and endless sheets of gold foil. A hoard so rich that the man who found it believed, in his excitement, that he was looking upon the very face of Agamemnon, the great king who in legend led the Greeks to Troy. He was wrong about the name and wrong about the date, for the mask was far older than any Trojan war, but he was not wrong about the world it came from. A world of warrior kings, of raiding and feasting and treasure, of bronze weapons and horse-drawn chariots, and a hunger for gold. And crucially, these Mycenaeans spoke Greek. We know this for certain, and knowing it is one of the small quiet triumphs of history, because the Mycenaeans, unlike the Minoans, left us writing that we can read. They had borrowed the idea of writing from Crete and adapted it into a script we call Linear B, and for a long time no one could make sense of it either, until a brilliant young architect with a gift for puzzles worked away at it in his spare time and at last cracked it open, and found, to the astonishment of the learned world, that the language hidden inside those little marks was an early form of Greek. So the language of Homer and Plato, the language still spoken in Greece today, can be traced back in an unbroken line more than 3,000 years, to clay tablets baked hard by the fires that destroyed the palaces that stored them. And what do those tablets say? Not poetry, sadly, and not history. They are lists. They are inventories and accounts, the dull and patient record-keeping of the palace bureaucracy. So many measures of grain paid in, so many sheep in such a flock, so many bronze wheels, so much oil set aside for the gods, this many women set to weaving. But even in their dryness they open a window, for they show us a world of tight central control, of a palace that gathered in the produce of the whole surrounding country, counted it, stored it, and handed it out again, ruled over by a figure the tablets call the Wonax, the Lord, the High King. This was the world the Greeks would half remember in their oldest stories, the world of the heroes. For it was to this Mycenaean age, looking back across a gulf of centuries, that the later Greeks set their greatest legends above all the tale of the war at Troy. They told how a prince of Troy, a rich city on the coast of Asia across the water, had carried off the beautiful wife of a Greek king, and how all the kings of Greece had bound themselves by an oath to sail against Troy and win her back, and how 1,000 ships had crossed the sea and sat before the walls of Troy for 10 long years, and how the greatest warrior of the age, swift-footed and terrible and doomed, had sulked in his tent over a slighted honour while his friends died, until grief drove him back into the fighting, and he killed the noblest of the Trojans, and dragged his body round the walls in the dust. Whether there was ever a real war at Troy, and what it was truly about, we cannot say. There was a real city where the poets placed Troy, on a windy hill above the straits that lead up to the Black Sea, and it was burned and rebuilt many times, and one of its burnings falls in about the right age. Perhaps a memory of some real Mycenaean raid upon that wealthy gateway city drifted down the generations, growing grander in the telling, until it became the war that launched 1,000 ships. What matters for us is not whether it happened, but that the Greeks believed it had, and told it and retold it, and shaped their whole idea of honour and glory and mortality around it. So that a Greek boy learned what it meant to be a man by learning the deeds of heroes who, if they ever lived at all, had lived in this vanished Bronze Age world. And it was a world that vanished with terrible suddenness. Somewhere around the year 1200 before the Common Era, and in the century that followed, the whole bright civilization of the Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean came crashing down, not just in Greece, but everywhere, in a wave of destruction so wide and so complete that historians still argue about its causes and simply call it, with a kind of awe, the Bronze Age collapse. Great cities across the whole region were burned and abandoned. Whole kingdoms that had traded and corresponded with one another for centuries simply ceased to exist. On the Greek mainland, one by one, the mighty fortress palaces went up in flames, Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, all of them, and this time they were not rebuilt. At Pylos, in the very last days before the fire, the palace scribes were still writing, and among the last tablets ever baked in the flames that destroyed the place are records of watchers being posted along the coast, of rowers being mustered, of anxious preparations against some threat coming from the sea. We do not know exactly what that threat was. The Egyptians, who suffered their own share of it, spoke of mysterious raiders they called the Sea Peoples, coming out of the north and the islands, burning as they came. Perhaps there were great movements of hungry people set in motion by drought and famine, for the climate seems to have turned against the whole region in these years. Perhaps earthquakes shattered the cities and rebellion finished them. Perhaps the very complexity of the Bronze Age world was its weakness, each kingdom so dependent on trade with the others, on the long thin lines of tin and copper and grain, that when a few of those lines were cut, the whole delicate web tore itself apart. Most likely it was all of these things at once, disaster piling upon disaster until the system could no longer bear its own weight, the way a great tree, weakened at the root, comes down all at once in a storm that a healthy tree would have shrugged off. Whatever the cause, the result was a plunge into darkness. The palaces were gone. The kings were gone. The bureaucrats with their careful tablets were gone, and with them, most remarkably of all, went writing itself. The Greeks forgot how to write. Linear B fell out of use and was not replaced. And for something like 400 years the Greek world had no written language at all. A thing almost unheard of, a civilization sliding backward out of literacy into a long forgetting. Populations shrank, villages were abandoned, fine craftsmanship declined. The grand painted pottery gave way to plainer, simpler wares. Trade withered. The memory of the great deeds of the heroes survived, but only in the mouths of poets, passed on by heart from one generation to the next around the fires of a poorer, smaller world. We call these centuries the Greek Dark Ages, and for a long time historians thought them simply empty, a blank between the glory of Mycenae and the glory of what came after. But they were not empty. In that long quiet darkness out of sight, the seeds of everything that made classical Greece were being planted. And it is into that darkness, that long slow healing, that we go next. The healing came slowly, as healing does, over centuries so quiet that hardly anyone living through them could have felt the change from one lifetime to the next. In little villages scattered across the mountains and the coasts and the islands, people kept their flocks and grew their barley and their olives and their vines, and buried their dead, and told their stories in the dark. And very slowly the population began to grow again, and the villages grew into towns, and something new began to take shape. Something that had not existed in the age of the palace kings, something that would become the very heart of Greek life. It was the polis, the city-state, and it is one of the most important ideas in this whole story, so let us settle into it gently. A polis was not just a city. It was a city together with the farmland around it, and above all it was the community of the people who belonged to it, bound together by shared laws and shared gods and a shared sense of us, a self-governing little world fiercely independent, that ran its own affairs and answered to no king beyond its own hills. There were hundreds of them, some no bigger than a large village with a few thousand souls, a handful of them, in time, great and famous. Each had its own high place, its Acropolis, a defensible hill crowned in later days with temples, where the people could shelter in war and honour their gods in peace. Each had its agora, an open space at the foot of the Acropolis where people gathered to buy and sell, to argue and gossip, to hear the news and settle disputes, the beating public heart of the town. And each was, to its own citizens, not merely a place to live, but a thing to love and to die for, an identity as deep as family. A Greek was not first and foremost a Greek. He was an Athenian, or a Spartan, or a Corinthian, or a Theban. And that loyalty to his own small city ran deeper than any loyalty to the wider Greek world, which is why the Greeks, for all their shared language and gods, could never unite for long, and spent so much of their history at war with one another. But that same fierce localism was also the engine of their genius. For hundreds of small communities, each free to try its own way of doing things, each competing against its neighbours in everything from warfare to poetry to athletics, made for a restless, inventive, argumentative world, a world always testing new ideas, that a single great empire, with its single official way of doing everything, could never have produced. And in the middle of these quiet centuries of recovery, two gifts arrived that would let this new world find its voice. The first was the alphabet. Long before, the Greeks had lost the art of writing altogether. Now, through their trading contacts with the Phoenicians, the great merchant sailors of the Levantine coast, they borrowed a set of letters, a Phoenician system for writing down the sounds of speech. But the Phoenician script wrote only the consonants, leaving the vowels to be guessed, and the Greeks made one small change that turned out to be enormous. They took some of the letters they did not need for their own consonant sounds and used them to stand for the vowels, and so created the first true alphabet in the full sense. A set of signs for every sound, consonant and vowel alike, simple enough that an ordinary person could learn it, not the guarded skill of a class of professional scribes, but a tool for everyone. It is the ancestor, through many changes, of the very letters your eyes would be reading now if they were open. And almost as soon as the Greeks had it, they used it for the second gift, which was poetry. For out of the long oral tradition of the Dark Ages, out of all those generations of singers reciting the deeds of the heroes from memory around the fire, there emerged, right at the dawn of Greek writing, two enormous poems of such power and beauty that they became the foundation of all later Greek culture, and were attributed to a single blind poet, whom the Greeks called Homer. One of them tells of a few weeks in the 10th year of the war at Troy, of the rage of the greatest of the Greek warriors and the terrible cost of it, of the death of the noble Trojan prince, and the grief of his old father, who comes by night to beg for his son's body. The other tells of the long wandering journey home of one of the Greek captains, the cleverest of them all, blown for 10 years about a sea full of monsters and witches and one-eyed giants, longing all the while for his home and his faithful wife, and the son he left as a baby. These two poems, learned by heart and recited at festivals, taught the Greeks who they were. They were their scripture and their history and their schoolbook all at once, the common inheritance that every Greek, whatever city he came from, could share. A boy learned his letters from them and learned his values from them, learned what courage was and what honour was, and what it meant that all men must die, and that the only immortality was to be remembered in song. Hold that thought, because it runs like a thread through everything that follows, this Greek hunger for glory, for a great name that will outlive the body, this sense that a short bright life gloriously remembered is worth more than a long dim one forgotten. It drove them to extraordinary things, and to terrible ones. And now, with towns growing and the alphabet spreading, and the old songs written down at last, the Greek world began, quite suddenly, to burst outward. For the poor stony land could not feed the growing numbers, and so, town by town, the Greeks began to send out colonies, shiploads of settlers who sailed away to found new cities on distant coasts. Each new city an independent polis in its own right, but keeping ties of affection and trade with the mother city that had sent it forth. And over about 200 years they spread astonishingly far. They planted Greek cities all around the shores of the Black Sea and along the coast of what is now Turkey and in North Africa and above all in southern Italy and Sicily, so thickly that the Romans later called that whole region Greater Greece. They founded a trading town in the far west that would one day be the French city of Marseille. A Greek sailor could travel from the eastern end of the Black Sea to the coast of Spain and find all along the way cities where his language was spoken and his gods were worshipped and the games he loved were played. The Greeks liked to say, with their gift for a vivid phrase, that they had settled around the shores of the sea like frogs around a pond. And it was true. A scattered necklace of independent little cities strung along thousands of miles of coast, all sharing that deep sense of Greekness, even as each governed itself. This great scattering carried Greek ideas out into the world and brought foreign ideas back in, and it made the Greeks rich, and it made them think, comparing their own customs with the strange customs of the peoples they now met and traded with. And that habit of comparison, of standing back and wondering why we do things this way and they do things that way, is one of the roots of the Greek gift for asking questions. And there was one more thing, in these same centuries, that bound the scattered Greeks together across all their quarrels and distances, and it began, so they later reckoned, in the year 776 before the Common Era, at a quiet sanctuary in the western Peloponnese, in a green river valley sacred to the king of the gods, a place called Olympia. There, every 4 years, the Greeks held a festival of athletic games in honour of their chief god, and to these Olympic games came competitors and spectators from every Greek city, from Italy and Sicily and the Black Sea, and everywhere in between. So important were they that a sacred truce was declared across the whole Greek world for their duration, so that athletes and pilgrims could travel safely to Olympia even through the territory of warring cities, and wars were interrupted so that men could run and wrestle and race their chariots. The prize was only a wreath of wild olive leaves, but the glory of an Olympic victory was beyond price, and a victor returned to his home city as a hero, sometimes with a hole knocked in the city wall so that he might enter through a breach no enemy had ever made, as if to say that a city with such a son needed no walls. The Greeks came to count their years by these games, one Olympiad to the next, 4 years at a time, so that the festival at Olympia became a kind of shared clock for a people who had no other. Here, then, is the Greek world taking shape at last, out of the long darkness, a world of hundreds of proud little cities, sharing a language and an alphabet, and the songs of Homer, and the gods on the mountain, and the games at Olympia, spread like frogs around the great pond of the Mediterranean, restless, inventive, and quarrelsome. And now, into this world, we must bring 2 cities in particular. 2 cities so different from one another that they seem almost like answers to opposite questions. And yet between them they would shape the whole classical age. One of them chose to become a nation of soldiers, the other chose, in time, to try something the world had never seen, and to let its ordinary people rule themselves. Their names were Sparta and Athens. Let us go first to Sparta, in the southern part of the Greek mainland, in a broad and fertile valley among high mountains in the region called Laconia. Sparta was strange even to the other Greeks, who regarded it with a mixture of awe and unease, the way one might regard a monastery of warriors. In the early days, Sparta had been a city much like any other, with poets and fine craftsmen, and a taste for beautiful things. But at some point, faced with the problem of ruling over a large conquered population, the Spartans remade themselves entirely, and turned their whole society into a single machine for producing soldiers. The story they told was that a lawgiver named Lycurgus had given them their system, all at once, long ago, though whether he ever really lived no one can say. What is certain is the shape of the thing they built, and it was like nothing else in the Greek world. The heart of the problem was numbers. When the Spartans had conquered the neighbouring region of Messenia, they had reduced its whole population to a kind of serfdom, a subject people bound to the land and forced to hand over half of everything they grew to their Spartan masters. These serfs were called helots, and there were very many of them, far more helots than there were Spartans, and the Spartans lived every day of their lives in the knowledge that they were a small ruling minority sitting on top of a large and resentful people who would rise and cut their throats the moment they showed weakness. So the Spartans made themselves permanently strong. Every full Spartan citizen was a soldier, and nothing but a soldier. He did no farming, no trade, no craft, for the helots did all the work that fed him, and the land supported him. His whole life, from birth to old age, was given over to preparing for war. A Spartan boy at the age of 7 was taken from his mother and given to the state, to be raised in barracks among other boys under a brutal discipline, taught to endure cold and hunger and pain without complaint, given too little to eat so that he would learn to steal cleverly to survive, and beaten if he was caught, not for stealing, but for being caught. This upbringing, the agoge, went on year after hard year, forging boys into men who could march and fight and obey without question, and stand in the battle line beside their comrades and never break. Even as grown men, Spartan citizens ate together every night in common messes, plain hard food, the famous black broth that visitors found almost inedible, so that no man grew soft in his own house. They were forbidden to fuss over wealth or luxury. They used heavy iron bars for money instead of silver and gold, deliberately, so that riches would be too clumsy to hoard and too worthless to tempt them. Their women, too, were unlike other Greek women, for they were raised strong and made to exercise and run and wrestle, on the theory that strong mothers bore strong sons. And Spartan women were famous throughout Greece for their boldness of speech and their freedom, and for the grim charge a Spartan mother was said to give her son as he went to war, handing him his heavy shield and telling him to come back with it or upon it, victorious or dead, but never to throw it away and run. All of this produced the finest soldiers in Greece, a small army of professional warriors in a world of part-time farmer soldiers, men who did not fear death and did not break in battle, whose scarlet cloaks and long hair and terrible discipline made them the most feared fighting force of the age. But it came at a cost. Sparta produced no philosophers, no great poets after its early days, no fine buildings, no lasting art. It was a society that had chosen one thing, military excellence, and sacrificed everything else to it, and it was suspicious of all change, closed to the outside world, forbidding its citizens even to travel abroad lest they bring home soft foreign ideas. It was, in a sense, a magnificent dead end, admired and never imitated, and its very rigidity meant that its numbers slowly dwindled over the centuries until at last there were too few Spartans left to hold up the enormous weight of the system they had built. But that lay far in the future. In the age we have now reached, Sparta was the acknowledged leading military power of Greece, and when the great crisis came, all Greek eyes would turn to Sparta to lead the fighting on land. Now let us go north, to a very different city, in the region called Attica, a rocky peninsula jutting out into the Aegean, and to the town gathered around a great flat-topped rock that rose from the plain, the Acropolis, with the sea not far off and a good harbour nearby. This was Athens, and its story runs in almost the opposite direction from Sparta's. Athens too began as a place ruled by aristocrats, by a handful of noble families who owned the best land, and held all the power and ground the poorer farmers down into debt, so harshly that a man who could not pay what he owed could be seized along with his wife and children, and sold into slavery to settle the debt. By the early years of the 6th century before the Common Era, Athens was close to tearing itself apart, the poor desperate and furious, the rich frightened and greedy, the whole city trembling on the edge of a bloody revolution. And here Athens did something that shows its character. Instead of civil war, the Athenians turned to a single wise man and gave him the power to reform their laws, a poet and traveller and man of moderation named Solon. And Solon set about the difficult work of easing the crisis without simply handing the city to one side or the other. He cancelled the debts that were crushing the poor. He forbade forever the practice of enslaving a citizen for debt, and he even used the city's money to buy back Athenians who had already been sold abroad into slavery and bring them home. He broke the total grip of birth on power and arranged that a man's political rights should depend not on who his ancestors were, but on how much he produced, so that a newly wealthy commoner could rise. And he gave even the poorest citizens the right to sit in the assembly and to serve on the juries that judged the city's cases. He did not make Athens a democracy, not yet, not by a long way, and both rich and poor grumbled that he had given them too little. But he had planted something. He had established the principle that the laws belonged to the whole community and stood above any faction, and that even the humblest citizen had a place, however small, in the running of the city. After Solon there came a time of turmoil, and for a good while Athens fell under the rule of a tyrant, though we must be careful with that word. For to the Greeks a tyrant did not necessarily mean a cruel monster, but simply a man who had seized sole power outside the law. And many tyrants were popular and capable rulers who beautified their cities and favoured the common people against the old nobility. The tyrant who ruled Athens and the sons who followed him did much to make Athens greater, building temples and fountains, encouraging festivals and the writing down of Homer, fostering the trade and the fine painted pottery that were making the city rich. But tyranny, however benign, sat badly with the Greek love of freedom, and in time the Athenians drove the tyrant's family out. And then, at the very end of the 6th century, Athens took the decisive step, under the guidance of a bold reformer named Cleisthenes, who, in a struggle against the return of aristocratic power, chose to base himself on the ordinary people and to give them a share of government greater than any people had ever held before. He reorganized the whole citizen body, breaking the power of the old family and regional loyalties, mixing the Athenians together into new artificial tribes that cut across the old divisions, so that men who had never worked together were now bound to serve together. He built up the council and the assembly, the gatherings where citizens debated and decided the business of the city, and he arranged things so that real power, the power to make the laws and declare the wars and spend the money, lay with the assembly of all the citizens meeting in the open air, each man with one vote, the poor cobbler counting for exactly as much as the great landowner. This was democracy, a word the Greeks themselves coined, meaning simply the power of the people, and it was the most radical political experiment the world had yet seen, and it was fragile and imperfect and limited, as we shall see, but it was real, and it changed everything. For now the Athenian citizen was not a subject who obeyed. He was a member who ruled, who spoke and voted and served in turn, who felt that the city was his own and its fate was in his hands. And men who feel that way, it turned out, will fight for their city with a spirit that no subject of a king can match. And that spirit was about to be tested, for far to the east, beyond the Aegean, beyond the Greek cities of the Asian coast, a vast new power had risen, greater than anything the Greeks had ever faced, an empire that stretched from the borders of India to the shores of the Aegean, ruled by a king who called himself the King of Kings. The Persians were coming, and the little quarrelling cities of Greece were about to face the largest empire on earth. To understand the Persians, picture an empire on a scale the Greeks could barely imagine. In the space of a single lifetime, a line of extraordinary kings had risen out of the highlands of what is now Iran, and conquered everything in their path, swallowing the ancient kingdoms one after another, until the Persian Empire reached from the Indus River in the east to the Aegean coast in the west, from the deserts of Egypt in the south to the steppes beyond the Caucasus in the north. The largest empire the world had ever seen, holding within it dozens of peoples and languages and gods, all bound together by good roads and a swift royal post and the iron will of the King of Kings, who sat in his palaces at the centre of the world and gathered the tribute of 100 nations. Compared to this colossus, the Greek cities were nothing. A scatter of poor little towns on the empire's far western edge, forever squabbling among themselves, unable to raise more than a few thousand men each. it would have seemed the most obvious thing in the world that these tiny states must, sooner or later, be absorbed into the empire like everything else, and indeed the Greek cities along the coast of Asia had already been taken, ruled now by the Persian king through local tyrants who answered to him. The trouble began there, on that Asian coast, in the region the Greeks called Ionia, where the Greek cities under Persian rule grew tired of their masters and rose in revolt. They sent across the sea to the free cities of the mainland to beg for help, and most of the mainland cities, wisely or not, wanted no part of a quarrel with the great king. But Athens, young in its democracy and full of the fire of its new freedom, sent ships and men to help their Ionian cousins, and in the course of the fighting the rebels marched inland and burned one of the Persian provincial capitals, a city called Sardis. In the end the revolt was crushed, as it was always likely to be. The Persian power too great, the Greek cities too divided, and the leading rebel city was destroyed and its people carried off. But the King of Kings, whose name was Darius, did not forget that a distant little city called Athens, a place he had scarcely heard of, had dared to send its ships across the sea to burn a city of his empire. The story was told, and it is too good a story to leave out even if it grew in the telling, that Darius asked who these Athenians were, and when he had been told, he took his bow and shot an arrow up into the sky and prayed to be granted vengeance upon them, and that he charged a servant to repeat to him 3 times, every day before dinner, the words, "Master, remember the Athenians." And so the eye of the greatest empire on earth turned toward Greece. The first Persian expedition came to grief when its fleet was wrecked by a storm rounding a stormy headland, the sea itself, the Greeks felt, fighting on their side. But Darius tried again, and in the year 490 before the Common Era, he sent a seaborne force straight across the Aegean, island hopping toward Athens, to punish the city that had burned Sardis and to bring the mainland Greeks under his hand. The Persian fleet crossed the sea, subduing the islands as it came, and landed its army on the coast of Attica, on a wide plain beside a curving bay, a plain whose name would ring down all the centuries afterward, the plain of Marathon, about a day's march from Athens itself. The Athenians marched out to meet them, some 9,000 or 10,000 citizen soldiers, joined only by a small loyal contingent from one little neighbouring city, for the Spartans, when begged for help, had answered that a religious festival forbade them to march until the moon was full, and so came too late for the battle. The Athenians stood almost alone, a few thousand amateur soldiers, farmers and potters and fishermen, who had left their fields and shops to defend their homes, facing a much larger army of the empire that had conquered the world. They waited for days at the edge of the plain, neither side willing to begin, the Athenian generals arguing among themselves whether to fight at all. And then, for reasons we do not fully know, perhaps because the Persian cavalry was for some reason away, the Athenians decided to attack, and they did a thing that astonished the enemy, for instead of advancing slowly and cautiously they came on at a run, charging across the open ground toward the Persian line, a solid wall of bronze shields and long spears. Ordinary men who had chosen to be free, hurling themselves at the servants of the great king. The Persians thought them mad, a handful of men rushing to their deaths with no cavalry and no archers to support them. But the Greek way of fighting, the massed line of heavily armoured spearmen shoulder to shoulder, each man's shield protecting the man beside him, the whole line pushing forward together as one, was a terrible thing to stand against. And where it closed with the more lightly armed Persian infantry, it simply rolled over them. The Athenians had deliberately thinned their centre and strengthened their 2 wings, and though the Persians broke through in the middle, the strong Greek wings crushed the Persian flanks and then turned inward, wheeling around to fall upon the enemy centre from both sides, catching the Persians in a trap and driving them in a broken route back toward their ships. The Persians fled to the sea and struggled to launch their vessels while the Greeks pursued them into the very surf, hacking at them among the boats. When it was over, the plain of Marathon was strewn with the bodies of thousands of Persians, and only a couple of hundred Athenians had fallen, and the greatest empire on earth had been beaten by a single Greek city standing almost alone. It is hard, lying here so many centuries later, to feel the full shock of that, but to the Greeks it was very nearly a miracle, a thing that reordered their sense of what was possible. The invincible Persians were not invincible after all. Free men fighting for their own soil and their own laws could stand against the servants of a king and win. The men who had fought at Marathon knew that they had done something that would never be forgotten, and they were right. For centuries later, when a great Athenian playwright who had himself fought in the battle came to write his own epitaph, he said nothing of his famous plays, and asked only that it be recorded that he had fought at Marathon. There is a famous story, probably not true but too dear to the Greek heart to have been invented by accident, that after the battle a runner was sent racing back to Athens with the news of the victory, and that he ran the whole way without stopping, some 26 miles, and burst into the city and gasped out the single word, "We have won," and then fell down dead from the effort, having spent his last breath in the service of the free city. And it is from that story, true or not, that the long-distance race we still run today takes its name. But the danger was not over. It was only postponed. Darius the great king was old, and he died before he could avenge the shame of Marathon. But he left a son, and that son, whose name was Xerxes, inherited both his empire and his grievance, and he was not a man to let such a defeat stand. For years he gathered his strength, summoning soldiers from every corner of his vast dominions, building up stores and ships and roads, preparing not a mere punitive raid this time, but a full invasion, an army and a fleet so enormous that they would, he intended, simply crush the whole of Greece beneath their weight and add it to the empire once and for all. And the Greeks, hearing the reports of these preparations growing year by year across the water, knew that the storm which had broken and receded at Marathon was gathering again, greater than before, and that this time it would not be one city that must stand, but all of Greece together, or none. The army that Xerxes led out of Asia was so vast that the Greek writers who described it reached for numbers beyond belief, millions of men, they said, drinking rivers dry as they passed. Though the true figure was surely far smaller, perhaps a few 100,000, which was still an army greater than anything the Greek world could dream of raising. It gathered from every nation of the empire, and it moved with a slow, crushing confidence, and to bring it into Greece Xerxes did two things that struck the Greeks as the very image of a king who thought himself master even of nature. Where a broad strait separated Asia from Europe, he ordered his engineers to build a bridge of boats right across the water, lashing hundreds of ships together side by side and laying a road across their decks so that his army could march dry-shod from one continent to the other, and when a storm broke the first bridge apart. The king in his fury was said to have ordered the sea itself to be whipped and branded as one might punish a disobedient slave before a second and stronger bridge was built. And where a stormy headland had wrecked the first Persian fleet a decade before, he set his men to dig a canal straight through the neck of the peninsula so that his ships could pass in safety. A great gash cut through solid land to spare his navy the dangerous cape. These were the acts of a man who believed that nothing could stand in his way, and to many of the Greeks, watching this endless host pour across the bridges and down through the north of Greece, city after city submitting without a fight, offering the earth and water that were the tokens of surrender, it must have seemed that nothing could. But not all the Greeks submitted. A number of the cities, led by Sparta and Athens, swallowing for the moment their endless quarrels, swore an alliance to resist, and they met to plan how a few could hope to hold against so many. Their answer was to fight where numbers would count for least, in the narrow places, the mountain passes, and the sea straits, where the vast Persian host could not bring its full weight to bear and would have to come on a little at a time. And so we come to one of the most famous stands in all of history, at a narrow pass on the eastern coast where the mountains came down almost to the sea and left only a slender road between the cliffs and the water, a place named for its warm springs, Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. Here a small Greek force marched north to hold the pass and buy time for the rest of Greece to prepare, and at its head was a king of Sparta with his personal guard of 300 Spartan warriors, together with several thousand other Greeks from various cities. 300 Spartans and their allies at the gates against the largest army in the world. When Xerxes sent a scout to look at them, the man came back and reported, to the king's astonishment, that some of the Spartans were calmly combing their long hair, and Xerxes could not understand it, until an exiled Greek in his service explained that this was the Spartan custom before battle, that these men were grooming themselves because they were preparing to die, and that they were the finest fighters in Greece, and that the king would find no harder task in all his conquest than to take this pass from these men. Xerxes waited 4 days, expecting the tiny force to lose its nerve and flee. It did not. On the 5th day he sent his troops forward, and they died in heaps in the narrow gate, unable to use their numbers, cut down by the long spears and heavy shields and iron discipline of men who did not break, and even his finest royal guard, the 10,000 he called the Immortals, could make no headway against them. For 2 days the Greeks held the pass and the Persian dead piled up, and Xerxes, watching from his throne above the field, is said to have leapt to his feet 3 times in fear for his army, and the pass might have held far longer had not a local man, for the promise of a reward, gone to the Persians by night and shown them a hidden path over the mountains, a goat track that led around behind the Greek position. So that in the darkness a strong Persian force climbed up and over and came down on the far side, and the Greeks in the pass learned at dawn that they were about to be surrounded. The Spartan king sent most of the allied army away to safety to fight another day, but he himself, with his 300 Spartans and a few others who would not leave, stayed to hold the pass to the end. For Spartan law and Spartan honour did not permit a Spartan to retreat, and there was a further reason whispered among them, an oracle that had foretold that either Sparta must fall or a Spartan king must die, and so the king chose to spend his own life to save his city. They fought that last morning knowing they would not see the evening, and when their spears were shattered they fought with swords, and when their swords were gone they fought with their hands and their teeth, and they died there to the last man, over the body of their king, and the Persians took the pass at last over a carpet of their own dead. It was a defeat. The pass was lost, and the road into central Greece lay open, and the Persian army poured through and marched south, and came at length to Athens itself, and burned it, temples and all, the smoke of the sacred Acropolis rising into the sky, just as Xerxes had sworn it would. And yet Thermopylae was not remembered as a defeat, but as something stranger and greater, a demonstration of what free men would pay to stay free. And the Greeks raised a stone over the fallen with an inscription that has never been bettered for its plainness, telling the passing traveller to go and say to the Spartans that here, obedient to their laws, they lie. But the war was not decided on land. Even as the pass was falling, the Greek and Persian fleets had been fighting off the coast nearby, and the real hope of Greece lay not with its soldiers but with its ships, and above all with the ships of Athens. For here the story circles back to the Athenians, who had done a remarkable and far-sighted thing in the years before the invasion. A rich vein of silver had been struck in the mines of Attica, and where another city might have shared out the windfall among the citizens as a pleasant bonus, an Athenian leader of great cunning and vision named Themistocles had persuaded the assembly instead to spend the whole of it on building a fleet, the largest navy in Greece, 200 warships. Long, sleek vessels driven by 3 banks of oars, with a bronze ram at the prow for smashing enemy ships, the fast and deadly triremes that would become the strength of Athens. He had argued for this fleet on the excuse of an old quarrel with a neighbouring island, but his true eye had always been on Persia, and now that foresight was about to save the Greek world. When Athens itself could not be held, Themistocles did a thing that shows the peculiar spirit of the place, for the Athenians voted to abandon their city altogether, to put their faith not in their walls but in their ships, in what one oracle had darkly called their wooden walls, and they evacuated the entire population, the old men and the women and the children, across to safety on the nearby islands and coasts, and left their homes to the enemy and took to the sea. And there, in the narrow strait between the mainland and the island of Salamis, within sight of their own burning city, the Greeks staked everything on a single battle at sea. The Persian fleet was larger than the Greek, and some of the Greek captains wanted to withdraw and defend the narrow neck of land to the south, rather than risk everything in the strait. But Themistocles knew that in the open sea the greater Persian numbers would tell, while in the cramped waters off Salamis those same numbers would become a curse, the great fleet crowding in on itself, with no room to manoeuvre. So he played a dangerous and brilliant trick. He sent a secret message to Xerxes, pretending to be a friend, warning the king that the Greeks meant to slip away in the night and urging him to block both ends of the strait at once and catch them while they were divided and afraid. Xerxes, eager to finish the war in one blow, believed it, and in the darkness he sent his ships to seal the exits and rowed his men back and forth all night so that by dawn the Persian crews were tired, while the Greeks had slept. And Xerxes himself, so sure of victory, had a throne set up on the slope of a hill overlooking the water, and sat down with his scribes beside him to watch his fleet destroy the last hope of Greece, and to note down the names of his captains who fought best, so that he might reward them. But it did not go as he expected. As the Persian ships pressed into the narrows packed together, they lost their order, and the heavier, steadier Greek triremes fell upon them in the confined water, ramming and shearing off their oars and boarding them, and the Persian vessels, too many for the space, fouled one another and crashed together, and could neither advance nor retreat, and the strait became a churning chaos of splintered wood and drowning men. All day the battle raged under the king's own eyes, and by evening the Persian fleet was shattered, hundreds of ships lost, the water thick with wreckage, and the survivors fled, and Xerxes, watching from his hill, saw his invincible armada broken by the ships of the little cities he had come to enslave. It was the turning point of the whole war. Without his fleet Xerxes could not feed and supply the enormous army he had brought into Greece, nor be sure of his bridge of boats back to Asia, and so the great king lost his nerve and turned for home, hurrying back across the strait before the Greeks could sail up and cut his bridge behind him. And he left the war to be finished by one of his generals with the pick of the army. That reckoning came the next year, on land, near a town called Plataea, where at last the full might of Sparta took the field, the largest Greek army ever gathered, the Spartan warriors at its heart, and in a long and hard-fought battle they broke the Persian army utterly and killed its general, and the invasion was over, and the same summer, so the Greeks said, on the very same day, the Greek fleet won another great victory across the sea on the coast of Asia, freeing the Ionian cities once more. The mightiest empire on earth had thrown its whole weight against the scattered little cities of Greece. Twice. And twice it had been thrown back into the sea, and Greece was free. Lie quietly with that for a moment, for it is one of the hinges on which the whole story turns. Everything that we think of as the glory of Greece, the temples and the philosophy and the plays and the democracy, all of it came after this, and might never have come at all. For a Greece absorbed into the Persian Empire would have been just one more province among many. Its little cities ruled by governors, its restless freedom tamed. Instead the Greeks had won, against all the odds, and they knew what they had done, and the knowledge filled them with an immense confidence, a sense that they had been tested against the greatest power in the world and had not been found wanting, that there was something in their way of life, in their freedom and their reason and their willingness to govern themselves, that was worth more than all the gold and all the armies of the King of Kings. And out of that confidence, in the 50 years that followed, and above all in the city of Athens, there came one of the most astonishing flowerings of human achievement that the world has ever seen. A burst of art and thought and building so concentrated in one small place and one short time that we have never quite stopped marvelling at it. Remember the hillside where we began, the Gothard sitting among the fallen marble without a thought for what it was. That marble, some of it, was raised in the years we are coming to now, and to understand why it still has the power to stop us in our tracks we have to see the spirit in which it was made. A city drunk on its own survival and its own freedom, pouring its energy and its wealth into making something beautiful and lasting, a monument not to a king but to itself, to the community of free citizens who had saved the Greek world. But first we must be honest about how that wealth was gathered, because the golden age of Athens has a shadow, and the shadow is worth seeing clearly even as we admire the light. After the Persian defeat, the Greek cities of the coasts and islands, still fearing that the Persians might return, banded together into a great alliance to keep up the fight and guard the sea, and they made Athens, with its powerful fleet, the leader of this league, and each member either sent ships or, more often, paid money into a common treasury to build and man the ships that Athens provided. It was, at first, a free alliance of equals for a common defence. But over the years it became something else. Athens grew stronger, and the other cities grew dependent, and gradually the free alliance hardened into an empire, with Athens as its mistress, collecting tribute from cities that had become subjects in all but name, putting down those that tried to leave, moving the common treasury to Athens itself, and dipping into it to beautify the city, until the money that the allies had paid to defend Greece was paying instead for the temples of Athens. The Athenians told themselves, and were told by their leaders, that this was only just, that Athens had earned her leadership by her sacrifices and her fleet, that the allies were safer and richer under her protection, and there was some truth in it. But there was also plain domination, one city ruling over many, and the resentment it bred among the subject cities, and the fear it bred among the free cities that had not joined, would in time gather into the storm that destroyed the very golden age it helped to pay for. Hold that shadow in mind, gently, without letting it darken everything, for both things are true at once, that the age was glorious, and that the glory was built in part on the tribute of the unfree, and the Greeks themselves, the most searching questioners the world had yet produced, would come to see the contradiction, and to argue about it on their own stages, in front of their own people, which is itself a kind of greatness. Now let us turn to the light. At the head of Athens in these years, for a whole generation, stood one man, elected again and again by the assembly to lead them, a man of noble birth and cool intelligence, and a strange remote dignity, so aloof and so eloquent that men said when he spoke it was as if he had lightning on his tongue. His name was Pericles, and though Athens was a democracy in which the people ruled, it was. One shrewd observer said, in his time in name a democracy, but in fact the rule of its first citizen, for the Athenians trusted Pericles and followed his guidance for so long that the age has taken his name, and we call it the Age of Pericles. It was he who led the building of the temples on the Acropolis to replace those the Persians had burned, and it was under his leadership that Athens became not just the strongest city in Greece, but its school, its theatre, its workshop of ideas, the place to which ambitious and talented men came from all over the Greek world to make their names, a city of perhaps 250,000 people, counting its women and its foreigners and its many slaves, that in the space of a lifetime produced more lasting beauty and more world-changing thought than nations of many millions have produced in centuries. Think first of the building. On the flat crown of the Acropolis, the sacred rock at the heart of Athens, the Athenians raised a temple to the goddess, who was the guardian of their city, a temple of white marble that we call the Parthenon, and it is worth lying still and picturing it as it was, not the honey-coloured ruin that stands there now, weathered and roofless and stripped, but as it rose when it was new, its marble freshly cut and gleaming, its sculptures painted in bright colours, its great gold and ivory statue of the goddess standing tall in the dim interior. What is astonishing about it is not its size, for it is not enormous, but its perfection, the care taken over every proportion, the subtle refinements that the eye can hardly catch, but the mind somehow feels. For the builders knew that perfectly straight lines look bowed to the human eye, and so they made almost nothing perfectly straight. The floor swells gently upward toward the centre. The columns lean very slightly inward, and bulge just perceptibly in the middle, and stand a little closer together at the corners, and each of these tiny deliberate distortions works against the tricks of our own vision, so that the whole thing looks more perfectly regular than perfect regularity would. A building bent everywhere in order to appear straight, made by men who understood that beauty is not mere correctness but a conversation between the thing and the eye that beholds it. Around the top of it ran a band of carved figures, a great procession of horsemen and elders and maidens and gods, carved so that the stone seems to breathe, the horses tossing their heads, the cloth clinging and flowing, the bodies caught in easy natural motion. And it was here, in these years, that Greek sculpture came fully into its own, learning to render the human body not as a stiff and staring idol, but as a living thing. Balanced and relaxed, weight resting on one leg, the whole figure caught in a moment of gentle movement, calm and noble and utterly human. The Greeks looked at the human body and found it beautiful and worthy of the closest study. And they made it the measure of all their art, and their statues of athletes and gods and ordinary citizens set a standard of grace and proportion that artists would return to and learn from for more than 2,000 years afterward, all the way down to our own time. But the Athenians did not only build and carve, they also, in these same years, invented something that had never existed before, and that we still cannot do without: the theatre. Out of old religious festivals in honour of the god of wine and revelry, in which choruses sang and danced, there grew, in Athens, the astonishing new art of drama, the telling of a story by actors who took on the parts of the characters and spoke their words as if they were living them, before a great crowd seated on the slope of a hillside, looking down at a round dancing floor with the actors upon it and the blue distance beyond. Each year the city held a competition of plays, and the whole population came, tens of thousands of citizens sitting all day in the open air, and the plays they watched were not light entertainments but searching, troubling explorations of the deepest questions a human being can ask. The tragedies took the old myths that everyone knew, the stories of the heroes and their doomed and cursed families, and used them to look hard at suffering and justice and fate and the terrible choices that trap human beings between one wrong and another, at a daughter sacrificed by her own father, at a king who unknowingly kills his father and marries his mother, and then, learning the truth, blinds himself in horror, at a woman torn between the law of the city and the love she owes her dead brother. The Athenians sat and watched these unbearable stories together, in public, as citizens, and wept over them, and thought about them, and the men who wrote them, a great line of tragic poets whose plays we still perform today, were honoured in Athens above almost anyone. And alongside the tragedies there was comedy, wild, obscene, riotously funny, and astonishingly free, for the comic playwrights were allowed to mock anyone and anything, to put the leading politicians of the day on stage as ridiculous figures of fun, to lampoon the generals and the philosophers and the gods themselves, to make the most savage jokes about the city's own leaders, while those very leaders sat in the audience. And this too was a kind of freedom that no king would ever have permitted. A city so sure of itself that it could laugh at its own rulers in public and count it a festival. Think of what that means, this thing the Athenians did, without quite knowing how remarkable it was, gathering the whole community to watch stories that questioned everything: the justice of the gods, the wisdom of the leaders, the rightness of the city's own wars, and to give the prize to the poet who questioned most deeply, or mocked most sharply. It is of a piece with everything else that was happening in Athens, this turning of a fierce, clear gaze upon the world and upon themselves, this refusal to simply accept what was handed down, this endless, restless asking of the question: but why? And is it really so? And could it not be otherwise? And that same spirit gave birth, in these years, to yet another new thing, which was history itself. For a man from one of the Greek cities of the Asian coast, a great traveller with an endless curiosity about the world, set himself to write down the story of the wars between the Greeks and the Persians, not as a poem, not as a tale of gods and heroes, but as an inquiry into what had really happened and why, gathering the accounts of those who had been there, weighing them, sometimes doubting them, travelling to Egypt and Babylon and the Black Sea coast to see for himself, and to record the customs and the histories of the many peoples he met along the way. His name was Herodotus, and we call him the father of history, because the very word history is his, a Greek word meaning inquiry, the finding out of things by asking and looking. And though he was credulous and loved a good story and passed on many wonders that were not true, he did something no one had done before. He tried to explain the human past by human causes, to understand a great event by patiently collecting evidence about it, and in doing so he founded the whole enterprise of trying to know our own story truly. A younger man, an Athenian who lived through the terrible war that was coming, would take that enterprise further still and write the history of his own times with a cold, unflinching honesty, seeking not to entertain but to understand, believing that human nature stays much the same from age to age, and that a clear account of how men behaved in one crisis might be useful to those who faced another, a possession, he said, for all time. Between them, these two founded a way of thinking about the past that is still at bottom our own. And underneath all of this, the temples and the sculpture and the plays and the histories, was the daily practice of the democracy itself. The thing that made Athens Athens. Nearly every day the citizens could gather in the marketplace and the council chambers, and many times a year several thousand of them would climb a hill near the Acropolis and sit down together in the open air as the assembly of the people, and there by a show of hands they would decide everything, whether to make war or peace, how to spend the city's money, what laws to pass, whom to send as ambassadors, how to punish those who had failed the city. Any citizen could stand up and speak and try to persuade the rest, and the humblest man's vote weighed as much as the greatest. The officials who carried out the daily business were mostly chosen not by election, which the Greeks thought favoured the rich and famous, but by lot, drawn at random from among the citizens, on the radical principle that any citizen was fit to govern, and that ruling and being ruled in turn was the very meaning of a free man's life. It was, we must remember, a democracy only for a part of the people. The women had no vote and lived lives largely confined to the household. The tens of thousands of slaves who did so much of the work had no rights at all. The foreigners who lived and traded in the city, however long they stayed, could never become citizens. By our measure it was narrow and unjust. And yet, within that narrow circle, it was a fuller and more direct self-government by ordinary people than the world had ever seen or would see again for thousands of years. A city where a poor farmer or a potter genuinely helped to steer the state, and it worked more or less for the better part of 2 centuries, and it left behind the idea, the dangerous and glorious idea, that ordinary people are fit to rule themselves, an idea that went underground for a very long time but never quite died, and that is in the end one of the greatest of all the gifts the Greeks left to us. But before we leave the height of the Golden Age, let us step down for a while out of the great matters, the wars and the empires and the philosophers, and simply walk through an ordinary day in a Greek city, because the small texture of daily life is a soothing thing to hold as sleep comes near, and because it is easy, amid the temples and the battles, to forget that most Greeks were not heroes or statesmen or thinkers but ordinary people, getting up in the grey light, making their bread, going about their work, coming home tired at evening, just as people always have. Picture then a modest house in a lane not far from the marketplace, a house of sun, dried mud brick with a red-tiled roof, plain on the outside, turning its back on the street. For the Greeks did not build to show off to their neighbours, but looked inward, and the house is arranged around a small open courtyard, where the light falls and a little altar stands, and perhaps a single tree grows. The rooms are simple and sparely furnished, a few wooden chests, some stools and low couches, clay lamps that burn olive oil with a small steady flame. The floors of beaten earth or plain stone. There is no clutter, for people owned little, and what they owned they valued. In the early morning the household stirs. The women of the house, who spend most of their lives within these walls, are already at work, for a great part of a woman's day was given to the making of cloth, to the carding and spinning of wool into thread on a weighted spindle, and the weaving of it into fabric on a tall upright loom, patient work. Hour after hour, the shuttle passing back and forth, and the cloth that clothed the whole family came from these hands. Bread is baking, the flat round loaves of barley or wheat that were the very centre of every meal, and there is olive oil. Always olive oil, for the olive was the tree of the goddess and the treasure of the land. Its oil used for cooking and for light and for rubbing on the skin and for 100 things besides. And there are olives themselves, and figs and cheese and onions, and in season the fruits of the garden, and fish from the sea, fresh or dried and salted, and only rarely meat. For meat was mostly eaten at the festivals when an animal was sacrificed to the gods, and the people shared the roasted flesh. It was a plain and frugal diet, the diet of a poor land, bread and oil and wine and whatever the season gave, and yet we know now that it was a wonderfully healthy way to eat, and people still praise and follow it today under the name of that same warm southern sea. The man of the house goes out into the day, into the street, and makes his way toward the heart of the city, the marketplace, the agora, which is already filling and stirring as the sun climbs. This open space at the foot of the sacred rock was the beating heart of the town, and it was many things at once. It was a market, where farmers brought in their produce from the countryside and set it out on trestles, vegetables and cheeses and live birds, where fishmongers cried their catch, where potters and shoemakers and metalworkers sold their wares from little stalls and workshops, where you could buy anything from a fish to a philosophy. But it was far more than a market. It was the public living room of the whole city, the place where men came not just to buy and sell, but to meet and talk, to hear the news, to argue about the latest decision of the assembly, or the latest play, or the doings of the generals, to gossip and to do business, and to see and be seen, standing about in little knots in the shade of the colonnades that ran along the edges of the square, talking, always talking, for the Greeks were a people who loved to talk above almost anything, and the endless conversation of the agora was the very medium in which their democracy and their philosophy alike were born. Here too were the public buildings, the council house where the citizens' council met, the offices of the magistrates, the courts where juries of hundreds of ordinary citizens judged the cases of the city, the shrines and the statues and the monuments, and it was here, remember, among these very stalls and colonnades, that the ugly old questioner had wandered, buttonholing the confident men of the city and asking them what they truly knew. Work in such a city was done by hand and on a small scale, in little family workshops rather than great factories, the potter at his wheel shaping the clay that would be painted with scenes of gods and heroes and athletes and fired to that beautiful red and black, the smith at his forge, the mason cutting stone, the cobbler stitching sandals, and much of the hardest and most unremarkable labour. In the workshops and the mines and the fields and the houses was done by slaves, the unfree men and women on whose backs so much of this bright civilization rested, captured in war or bought in the market, some treated with rough kindness almost as members of the household, others worked to death in the silver mines in the dark, and it is right that we remember them. The silent unfree multitude without whom the citizens would have had no leisure to make their art and their philosophy and their democracy at all. In the countryside beyond the walls, where most people after all still lived, the farmer's year turned with the seasons in the old unchanging round, the ploughing and the sowing when the autumn rains had softened the ground, the long anxious waiting through the winter, the grain harvest in the early summer heat, the threshing on the round stone floor, the vintage in the autumn when the grapes were gathered and trodden and the new wine set to work, and above all the gathering of the olives in the late year, the beating of the branches and the picking up of the fruit and the pressing of it for the precious oil. It was hard work on thin and stony soil, and it bred a tough, careful, weather-wise people, close to the land, who measured their wealth in vines and olive trees and a few sheep and goats on the rough hillsides, and who knew that the good life depended, in the end, on the rain coming at the right time and the frost holding off, as country people have always known. And in the evening, when the work was done, a man of some means might go to a gathering that the Greeks loved, a drinking party among friends called a symposium, where the men reclined on couches around the edges of a room, garlanded with flowers, and drank wine, always mixed with water, for to drink it neat was thought the mark of a barbarian, and talked and sang and listened to music and played games, and argued far into the night about love and virtue and the state of the world, and some of the greatest works of Greek thought are written as if they were the conversation of such an evening, the talk of friends over the wine, drifting from joke to earnestness and back again. In the lamplight, with the night outside, it was in such small and human settings, the courtyard and the loom, the marketplace and the workshop, the terraced field and the lamplit supper, that the ordinary life of Greece was lived, generation after generation, beneath the great events, and it is a gentle thing to remember, as you lie here in your own quiet house in the dark, that for all the vast distance of years, those long ago people rose and worked and ate their bread and loved their children and grew tired at evening and lay down to sleep under the same stars and were in the end so very much like us. To live inside the Greek world, though, we must also feel the presence of the gods, for the Greeks lived among their gods as among neighbours, close and familiar, and not always kind. Their gods were not remote and perfect beings, but a great unruly family, gloriously human in their passions, quarrelling and loving and taking sides, dwelling, it was said, on the cloudy summit of the highest mountain in Greece, Mount Olympus, from which they looked down and meddled in the affairs of men. There was the king of the gods, lord of the sky and the thunderbolt, forever falling in love, and forever being scolded for it by his jealous queen. There was the god of the sea who shook the earth when he was angry. There was the grey-eyed goddess of wisdom and war and craft, who was the special guardian of Athens and gave the city her name. There was the golden god of the sun and music and prophecy, and his wild twin sister the huntress, and the laughing goddess of love, and the lame smith god who made the weapons of heaven at his forge, and the swift messenger with the winged sandals, and the grim lord of the dead in his shadowy kingdom underground, and the god of wine and madness and the theatre, and many more besides, and the countless lesser spirits of the springs and the woods and the rivers, so that no place was without its god, and no act of life was without its holy dimension. The Greeks did not have a book of scripture or a set of commandments or a church with priests who told them what to believe. Their religion was a matter of doing rather than believing, of honouring the gods with sacrifice and festival and prayer, of pouring out a little wine before drinking, of keeping the great feasts, of not offending the powers that governed the harvest and the sea and the fate of cities. And when they wished to know the will of the gods, or to peer into the future, they went to the oracles, the holy places where a god was believed to speak through a human mouth, and the greatest of these was at Delphi, high on the slopes of a mountain above a deep valley, where in a smoky chamber a priestess sat upon a sacred tripod, and filled with the spirit of the god, gave out answers to the questions that kings and cities and ordinary men brought to her from all over the Greek world and beyond. The answers were famously riddling, capable of being read more than one way, and there were bitter stories of men who marched confidently to disaster, because they had understood the oracle to mean the opposite of what it meant. But the Greeks kept coming. For 1,000 years they kept coming, because the uncertainty of life pressed on them as it presses on us, and they longed as we long for some word from beyond the veil. Carved on the temple at Delphi were 2 short sayings that catch something deep in the Greek spirit: know yourself and nothing in excess. A counsel of self-knowledge and of moderation, of understanding your own nature and its limits, and not overreaching them. For the Greeks believed that the worst of all faults was the arrogance that made a man forget he was mortal and reach for what belonged to the gods, and that such pride was always, sooner or later, brought low. And yet in the very same world of oracles and sacrifices and jealous gods, there arose the most extraordinary thing of all, the thing for which the Greeks are perhaps most remembered: the birth of philosophy, of reasoned inquiry into the nature of the world. It began, as so much did, on the Greek coast of Asia, in the rich trading cities of Ionia, where men in contact with the older wisdom of Egypt and Babylon began, a little before the Persian Wars, to ask a new kind of question. They looked at the world, at the endless changing variety of it, the sea and the stars and the growing plants and the living animals, and instead of explaining it by the doings of the gods, they began to ask whether there might be some single underlying stuff, some basic principle, out of which everything was made and by which everything could be understood. One of them said that everything was ultimately water, another said it was air, another said that the world was made of tiny invisible particles too small to see, endlessly falling and combining in the void, an idea that would sleep for 2,000 years and wake at last, astonishingly close to the truth as the theory of atoms. It hardly matters that their particular answers were mostly wrong. What matters, what changed the world, was the kind of question, for these men were doing something no one had quite done before, seeking to explain nature by nature itself, by reason and observation, rather than by the will of the gods, looking for laws and causes rather than for stories, and in doing so they lit the small flame from which all of science, all of philosophy, all of our whole way of trying to understand the world by thinking clearly about it, would one day grow. They asked what the world was made of and how it changed, and whether change was even real or only an illusion, and what number and shape had to do with the deep structure of things. And one of them, a strange half-mystical thinker, who believed that the secret of the universe lay in numbers and their harmonies, and who discovered the beautiful hidden relationships between the lengths of a plucked string and the musical notes it sounds, gave his name to a rule about triangles that schoolchildren still learn today. These first philosophers turned the human mind, for the first time, into an instrument for understanding the deep nature of reality, and once that instrument had been forged, it could be turned upon anything. Not only upon the stars and the sea, but upon human life itself, upon the question of how we ought to live, and what is good, and what is just, and what we can truly know. And it was in Athens, in the years after the Great War, in the crowded, questioning city at the height of its confidence, that philosophy took that fateful turn inward, away from the stars and toward the soul, in the person of one strange, ugly, barefoot old man who wrote nothing down and yet changed the course of human thought forever. But before we come to him, let us pause and breathe, and let the picture of this Greek world settle around you as you lie in the quiet dark, the whole of it now, the little white cities on their hills, the terraced fields of olives and vines climbing the slopes, the fishing boats on the wine-dark sea, the temples gleaming on the heights, the crowds gathered in the theatre and the assembly, the athletes running at Olympia, the pilgrims climbing to Delphi, the gods looking down from their mountain, and the men in the marketplace arguing, always arguing, about the nature of things. It was not a peaceful world, and it was not a gentle one, and it rested, we must never forget, on the labour of slaves and the silence of women and the tribute of subject cities. But it was awake in a way that few human worlds have ever been awake, restless and curious and unwilling to leave anything unquestioned, and it was about to tear itself to pieces. For the very freedom and pride and rivalry that made the Greeks so brilliant also made them unable to live in peace with one another, and the two great cities that had together saved Greece from Persia, the sea power of Athens and the land power of Sparta, so utterly unlike in everything they valued, now faced one another across a Greece grown too small to hold them both, and the fear each felt of the other's growing strength was hardening, year by year, into a quarrel that all the wisdom of Greece would not be able to stop. The Golden Age carried its own destruction inside it, and the same generation that raised the Parthenon and watched the great tragedies and listened to the first philosophers would live to see the beginning of a long and ruinous war that would drain the strength out of the Greek world and end its brief bright noon forever. The war between Athens and Sparta and their allies is called the Peloponnesian War, after the great southern peninsula of Greece, where Sparta and most of her allies lay, and it lasted, on and off, for 27 years, and by the end of it the Golden Age was over and the Greek world was exhausted and bleeding, and would never again be quite what it had been. The deep cause was simple, and the Athenian historian who lived through it and wrote its story saw it clearly, that the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta made the war inevitable. Athens had grown too strong, her empire too large, her fleet too dominant, her wealth and ambition too visible, and Sparta and her allies, watching this restless sea power spread its influence wider and wider, came to believe that if they did not fight now, they would soon be surrounded and strangled, and so, over a series of quarrels among the smaller cities that drew in the great ones behind them, the two alliances at last came to open war. Pericles, who still led Athens as the war began, had a clear strategy, and it was a hard one for a proud people to accept. He knew that Sparta and her allies were far stronger on land, that their magnificent soldiers could not be beaten in open battle by the Athenians, and that if the Athenians marched out to defend their fields, they would simply be destroyed. So he told them to do the opposite. He told them to abandon their countryside, to bring the whole population of the surrounding farmland inside the long walls that joined the city to its harbour, to give up their fields and their farms and their homes to the enemy without a fight, and to rely instead on their command of the sea, which no Spartan army could touch, to bring in food from across their empire, and to raid the coasts of the enemy at will. Athens, he saw, could not lose as long as she held the sea and did not risk her army, and Sparta could not win against a city she could not reach. It was a cold and painful strategy, for it meant watching from the walls each year as the Spartan army marched into Attica and burned the crops and cut down the ancient olive trees and ravaged the land where the Athenians had been born, and doing nothing, and it went against every instinct of a warrior people. But it might well have worked, had it not been for a thing that no strategy could foresee. For with the whole population of the countryside crammed inside the walls, packed into every spare corner of a city built for far fewer, in the heat of summer, with the sanitation of the ancient world, a terrible plague broke out, some sickness whose exact nature we still cannot name, and it swept through the crowded city like fire through dry grass, and it killed, over the years it raged, perhaps a quarter or a third of the whole population of Athens, and among the dead, in the second year of the war, was Pericles himself. The historian who survived it caught the disease and lived, and he left a description of it so precise and so unflinching, the burning fever. The raw throat, the ulcers, the unquenchable thirst, the despair, that physicians have puzzled over it ever since, and he left too a description of something worse than the disease, the breakdown of order and decency and hope that came with it, as men who expected to die soon saw no reason to restrain themselves, and the laws of gods and men alike lost their hold, and the city seemed to come apart. Athens survived the plague, but she was never the same, and she had lost the one man whose cool judgment might have kept her strategy steady, and the leaders who came after him were bolder and greedier and less wise, and the war, which might have been ended by a sensible peace, dragged on, flaring up and dying down, neither side able to strike a decisive blow, the land power unable to take the sea power unable to win on land, both grinding each other down year after weary year. There was a truce, a peace that both sides swore would last a generation, and it fell apart in a few years. And then Athens, restless and overconfident, made the greatest mistake of the whole war, a mistake so vast that it broke the back of her power. Far to the west, in Sicily, that great island off the toe of Italy thickly settled with Greek cities, there was a quarrel among those cities, and Athens was invited to intervene, and a brilliant, charming, reckless young Athenian leader persuaded the assembly to send not a small force, but an enormous expedition. The greatest armada Athens had ever launched, to sail all the way across the sea to Sicily and conquer the richest and most powerful city there, and perhaps the whole island, and perhaps more, in a dream of Western empire that would make Athens mistress of the entire Greek world. It was a magnificent gamble, and it was madness, and the wisest heads in Athens said so. But the city was drunk on its own ambition, and the great fleet sailed away amid crowds and prayers and singing, and the whole population came down to the harbour to see it go, hundreds of ships bright with paint, thousands of men, the flower of Athenian strength, rowing out toward the west in the summer sun. And in Sicily everything went wrong. The charismatic young leader who had championed the whole scheme was recalled to face charges at home almost as soon as he arrived, and rather than return to trial he defected to the enemy, to Sparta, and gave the Spartans the very advice they needed to defeat his own city. The remaining commanders were cautious and unlucky, and slow. The great city they had come to conquer held out, and got help from Sparta, and the besiegers became the besieged, trapped in the harbour and the marshes, their fleet bottled up and beaten in the very waters they had come to command, their army sick and starving. And when at last they tried to break out and retreat overland across Sicily, the whole enormous expedition was hunted down and destroyed, the men cut to pieces or driven into a river to be slaughtered as they drank, and the survivors, thousands upon thousands of them, were herded into the stone quarries of the enemy city and left there in the sun and the cold, with almost no food or water, packed together among their own dead and dying for weeks until most of them had perished, and the rest were sold into slavery. The fleet was gone. The army was gone. The flower of a generation of Athenian men lay dead in a far western island, and when the news came home to Athens, at first the city would not believe it, and then it fell into a horror and a grief from which it never truly recovered. Athens fought on astonishingly for years more, with a stubborn courage that even her enemies admired, rebuilding her fleets, winning battles she had no right to win, refusing again and again the peace that was offered her. But the disaster in Sicily had broken something that could not be mended, and now her subject cities began to revolt, and the Persians, delighted to see the Greeks destroying one another, poured money to Sparta to build a fleet that could challenge Athens at sea. And slowly, remorselessly, the noose tightened. Until at last, after one final catastrophic defeat of the Athenian fleet, Athens was blockaded and starved and could fight no more, and surrendered. Her long walls were pulled down to the sound of flute girls playing, and the men who tore them down believed, the historian says, that this day was the beginning of freedom for Greece. They were wrong, as we shall see, but the great age of Athens was over, and the city that had beaten the King of Kings, that had raised the Parthenon and given the world the theatre and history and democracy, lay beaten and humbled by fellow Greeks, and the long noon of the Golden Age had ended in ruin. And here, in the bruised and bitter years just after the Great War, we must at last meet the barefoot old man, for it was into a defeated and frightened Athens, an Athens that had lost its confidence and its temper, and was looking for someone to blame, that the strange figure of Socrates walked to his death. He had lived through the whole Golden Age and the whole ruinous war, an ugly, snub-nosed, shabby man who owned almost nothing and wanted almost nothing, who spent his days in the marketplace and the wrestling schools doing the oddest thing imaginable, simply talking to people, asking them questions. But what questions? He would fall into conversation with a confident man, a politician sure he knew what justice was, a general sure he knew what courage was, a priest sure he knew what holiness was, and he would ask them, with the greatest politeness and the appearance of humble ignorance, to explain to him, since they knew and he did not, what justice really was, or courage, or holiness, and then he would gently examine their answers, and show that they contradicted themselves, and that the confident man did not after all truly know what he thought he knew, and that beneath his certainty lay only muddle. Socrates claimed to teach nothing and to know nothing himself, except, he said, the one thing that he did not know, which already made him wiser than those who did not know but thought they did. He believed that the unexamined life was not worth living, that the most important task a human being could undertake was to care for the health of the soul by seeking, relentlessly, honestly, to understand what goodness truly was, on the conviction that no one does wrong willingly. That wrongdoing comes from ignorance of the good, and that if a man could only truly know what was right he would do it. He was, in his stubborn, ironic, endlessly questioning way, the most annoying man in Athens, and also, many came to feel, the best. And he gathered around him a circle of brilliant young men who loved him and followed him and delighted in watching him puncture the pretensions of the powerful. But a city that has just lost a great war, and that has seen some of those very young followers of Socrates turn out badly, betray the democracy, side with the enemy, is not in a mood to be told that it does not know what it thinks it knows. And so, when Socrates was an old man of 70, his enemies brought him to trial before a great jury of his fellow citizens on a charge of corrupting the young and of not believing in the gods of the city, and the real charge, unspoken, was simply that he was a maddening gadfly who would not stop asking his questions and would not flatter the people and the jury by a narrow vote, found him guilty and condemned him to death. He could have escaped. His friends arranged everything, bribed the guards, prepared a way out of the city, begged him to flee. He refused. He had lived his whole life as a citizen under the laws of Athens, he said, and had enjoyed their protection, and it would be a betrayal of everything he believed to break those laws now, merely because they had turned against him, and so he stayed, and on the appointed day, surrounded by his weeping friends, calm and even cheerful, still talking and questioning to the last about the soul and whether it might be immortal, he drank the cup of poison hemlock that the law prescribed, and lay down and died. And in that death, the city that had killed him gave him an immortality it could never have imagined. For the greatest of his followers, a young man of noble family named Plato, was so marked by the life and death of his teacher that he devoted the rest of his own long life to philosophy, and wrote in a series of dialogues of extraordinary beauty and depth, conversations in which Socrates is nearly always the central speaker, so that the barefoot old man who wrote nothing became, through his pupil's pen, one of the most influential figures who ever lived. Plato went far beyond his teacher. He came to believe that behind the changing, imperfect, shadowy world we see with our eyes there lies a higher, truer, perfect world of eternal forms, of ideal justice and beauty and goodness themselves, which our world only dimly copies, and that the task of the philosopher is to turn away from the shadows and struggle upward toward the light of that true reality. And he told this in a famous image of prisoners chained in a cave, watching shadows on the wall and taking them for the whole of reality, until one of them is freed and climbs up into the daylight and sees the sun and the real world for the first time, and then must go back down into the dark to try, against their disbelief and their anger, to tell the others what is truly there. Plato founded a school in a grove outside Athens, a place called the Academy, from which we still get our word for the pursuit of learning, and it endured for centuries. And to that school there came, as a young man, the third of the great line, a pupil of Plato as Plato had been a pupil of Socrates, and in some ways the greatest of them all, at least in the sheer range of his mind. A man named Aristotle. Where Plato looked upward toward the perfect forms, Aristotle looked outward at the world itself, and set himself, almost single-handedly, to organize the whole of human knowledge, to study and classify everything. The animals and the plants, the stars and the weather, the workings of the human body and the human mind, the forms of government and the nature of a good life, the rules of correct reasoning, the structure of a good poem or a good tragedy. He was the first great systematic biologist, dissecting creatures and recording their parts with patient care. He invented the formal study of logic, of how to reason validly from one statement to another that would be taught almost unchanged for 2,000 years. He wrote on ethics, arguing that the good life is not a life of pleasure or of honour, but a life lived in accordance with reason and virtue, and that happiness is not a feeling but an activity, the exercise of our human powers at their best over a whole lifetime. And that virtue itself is a kind of balance, a middle way between too much and too little, courage lying between cowardice and rashness, generosity between meanness and waste. Together these three, the teacher who questioned, the pupil who dreamed of the eternal forms, and the pupil of that pupil who sought to know everything, laid down so much of the framework of Western thought that for many centuries afterward a scholar could simply call Aristotle the philosopher, as though there had been only one. And much of the intellectual history of the next 2,000 years can be told as a long argument with these three Athenians. And here is one of the quiet ironies of our story, worth turning over gently in the dark, that this greatest flowering of Greek thought came not in the confident noon of the Golden Age, but in the tired, disillusioned century after the Great War, as though the shattering of Athens' political dreams had turned her best minds inward, away from the assembly and the empire, and toward the deeper and more lasting questions of what is true and how we should live. For the political world of Greece in these same years was a sorry and exhausting spectacle. Sparta, having won the Great War, proved a clumsy and hated master, no better than the Athens she had replaced, and soon the other cities turned against her. And there followed decades of pointless, grinding warfare, the cities shifting alliances, betraying one another, hiring themselves out, wearing themselves down, first Sparta on top, then broken in her turn by the sudden brief brilliance of the city of Thebes, which under a gifted general devised new tactics and shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility on the battlefield. And then Thebes too fading, until the whole of Greece lay drained and divided and quarrelsome, no city strong enough to master the rest, all of them too jealous ever to unite. A brilliant civilization that had beaten the greatest empire on earth, now unable to stop tearing at its own flesh. And while the old cities of the south wore themselves out in their endless quarrels, they paid little attention to a rough half-Greek kingdom away to the north, a land of mountains and horsemen and hard-drinking nobles that the polished southerners regarded as backward and barely civilized, a place called Macedon. It was a mistake. For in Macedon there had come to the throne a king of extraordinary cunning and ambition, and he had been watching the Greeks and learning from them, and he meant to do what no Greek city had ever managed to do, to bring the whole of Greece under a single hand, his own. This king, whose name was Philip, had spent some years of his youth as a hostage in Thebes, in the very city that had lately humbled Sparta, and there he had studied at first hand the finest military thinking in Greece. And when he came to his own throne he took what he had learned and forged from it a new kind of army, the most formidable fighting machine the Greek world had yet seen. He rebuilt the Macedonian infantry around a fearsome new weapon, an enormously long pike, far longer than the ordinary Greek spear, so long that it took both hands to wield. And he trained his soldiers to stand in a deep tight block, rank behind rank, and to lower these pikes so that the men in the first several ranks all projected their points beyond the front of the formation, presenting to the enemy a bristling, impenetrable hedge of steel, a wall of spear points 5 deep that no one could get near. This was the Macedonian phalanx, and against it the older Greek way of fighting, the single shallow line of spearmen, was simply outreached and outmatched. And Philip combined this deadly infantry with something the southern Greeks had always lacked, a superb force of heavy cavalry, the horsemen of the Macedonian nobility, the companions of the king, who would charge home at the decisive moment and break a shaken enemy, so that the phalanx became the anvil that held the enemy fast, while the cavalry was the hammer that shattered them. With this army, and with a cunning that matched it, buying his enemies where he could not beat them, promising and betraying, marrying and bribing, striking swiftly where he was least expected, Philip spent 20 years making himself the master of the north and then reaching down city by city into the quarrelsome tangle of Greece itself. The Greeks were slow to understand the danger. In Athens there was one man who saw it clearly from the beginning, a great orator, perhaps the greatest who ever lived, who had overcome a childhood stammer by, it was said, practicing his speeches with pebbles in his mouth and declaiming against the roar of the sea, and who now poured out all his genius in a series of thunderous speeches warning his fellow Athenians that Philip was not a distant nuisance but a deadly enemy who meant to enslave them all, and begging them to rouse themselves, to stop drifting, to spend their money on defence rather than festivals, to unite with the other cities while there was still time. His speeches against Philip were so famous and so fierce that we still call any bitter denunciation by their name. But the Athenians were comfortable and divided and reluctant, and by the time enough of the Greek cities finally banded together to resist, it was late, and on a plain in central Greece the combined army of the last free Greek cities met Philip's Macedonians in the battle that decided the fate of Greek independence. Philip's army won. The Greek line was broken, the cavalry charge led, it was said, by Philip's own teenage son, cut through the finest troops the cities could field, and when the day was over the age of the free and independent Greek city-state, was, for all practical purposes, at an end. Philip was now the master of Greece. He did not destroy the cities or occupy them harshly, for he wanted the Greeks not as slaves, but as partners in a far greater design. He called the cities together and formed them into a league under his own leadership, and he announced to them his grand purpose, the purpose that would bind the quarrelling Greeks together at last in a common cause, that they would all march east together, Macedonians and Greeks as one, to invade the empire of Persia, to avenge the old wrongs of the great invasions, to free the Greek cities of Asia, and to win the boundless wealth of the King of Kings. It was a brilliant stroke, a war against the ancient enemy to unite the Greeks behind him. But Philip did not live to lead it. At the height of his power, as the great expedition was being prepared, at his daughter's wedding feast amid all the pomp of his triumph, he was struck down and killed by one of his own guardsmen, for reasons that were murky then and remain murky now, some private grievance, some whisper of a wider plot, we cannot say. And so the enormous enterprise he had built, the finest army in the world and the mastery of Greece and the planned invasion of Persia, all of it passed, suddenly, to his son, a young man of 20, and the young man's name was Alexander. He had been raised for greatness from the cradle. His mother had filled his head with the belief that he was descended from the greatest of the old Greek heroes, the very warrior of the tale of Troy, and Alexander slept, it was said, with a copy of the poem of that war beneath his pillow, and modelled himself all his life on its doomed and glorious hero. His father had given him the best education the world could offer, sending for the greatest mind of the age, the philosopher Aristotle himself, to be the boy's private tutor, so that the future conqueror of the East was schooled in his youth by the man who was organising the whole of human knowledge. And something of that teaching, a curiosity about the world, about its plants and animals and peoples, would travel with Alexander to the ends of the earth. There is a story told of his boyhood that catches the whole of him. A magnificent horse was brought before his father, a huge and beautiful animal, but so wild and unmanageable that no one could ride him, and the king ordered the useless beast taken away. But the boy Alexander had been watching, and he said quietly that it was a pity to lose so fine a horse for want of the skill to handle him, and his father, half amused and half annoyed, allowed the boy to try. And Alexander, who had noticed what the grown men had not, that the horse was terrified of its own shadow, turned the animal to face the sun so that the shadow fell behind it out of sight, and spoke gently to it, and stroked it, and then leapt lightly onto its back and rode it. And his father, watching, is said to have wept with pride, and told his son to seek out a kingdom worthy of himself. For Macedon was too small to hold him. The horse was named Bucephalus, and Alexander rode him for 20 years, all the way to India, and wept again when at last the old horse died, and built a city over his grave. That was the young man, 20 years old, headstrong, brilliant, fearless to the point of madness, hungry for glory beyond all reason, who now, with his father dead and Greece uneasy beneath him, and the whole enterprise trembling on the edge of collapse, took up the crown of Macedon and the leadership of Greece and the dream of the conquest of Asia, and prepared to make himself the most famous conqueror in the history of the world. His first task was to hold together what his father had won, for the news of Philip's death had set the whole of his world in motion, the northern tribes stirring, the Greek cities hoping that this untried boy might be the moment to throw off Macedon at last. Alexander moved with the speed that would become his signature, striking north to crush the tribes in a lightning campaign, then wheeling south when the city of Thebes rose against him, appearing before its walls before the Thebans even knew he was near, and when the city refused to yield he stormed it, and, to teach all Greece a lesson it would not forget, he destroyed it utterly, razing the ancient city to the ground and selling its surviving people into slavery, sparing, they say, only its temples and the house of a long-dead poet. The lesson was learned. No Greek city stirred against him again, and with his rear secure and grease cowed into obedience, Alexander was free at last to turn east to the great enterprise his father had planned, the invasion of the Persian Empire. In the spring, at the age of 22, he led his army, some tens of thousands of Macedonians and Greeks, across the narrow strait that divides Europe from Asia, and as his ship approached the Asian shore he is said to have hurled his spear so that it stuck quivering in the ground, claiming the whole continent as his own, spear won, a gift from the gods, and he leapt ashore in full armour and went first, before any campaign, to the ruins of Troy. To honour the tomb of the hero he had modelled himself upon since boyhood, and there he took from the temple an ancient shield said to have survived from the Trojan War, and had it carried before him into every battle he fought thereafter. So the dream and the reality began together on the Asian shore. The Persian Empire he had come to conquer was no longer quite the terror it had been in the days of the great invasions, but it was still by far the largest and richest state in the world, vast beyond imagining, with endless reserves of men and money, and its king, another in the long line of kings, could raise armies many times the size of Alexander's little force. It should have been impossible. What Alexander had, against all that wealth and numbers, was the finest army in the world, the phalanx and the companion cavalry his father had forged, hardened veterans and brilliant officers, and he had himself, a commander of genius and a reckless personal courage that made his men worship him, for he led every charge from the front, in the thick of the fighting, always at the point of greatest danger, so that he was wounded again and again over the years, and his soldiers, seeing their king risk everything beside them, would follow him anywhere. 3 great battles broke the Persian Empire. The first came at a river called the Granicus, soon after the landing, where the local Persian forces gathered to throw the invader back into the sea. And Alexander, against all cautious advice, charged straight across the river and up the far bank into the waiting enemy. And in the wild fighting he was nearly killed, his helmet split by an axe, saved at the last instant by a companion who cut down the man about to strike the death blow. But the Persian line broke, and Asia Minor lay open, and the Greek cities of the coast were freed, as had been promised, from their Persian masters. The second battle came more than a year later, far to the south, at a place called Issus, where the Persian king himself, with an enormous army, had come up behind Alexander and cut him off, catching him, as it seemed, in a trap. But the ground was narrow, hemmed between the mountains and the sea, and the great Persian numbers were useless in so tight a space. And Alexander drove his cavalry straight at the heart of the enemy line, straight toward the king himself in his high chariot. And the King of Kings, seeing death coming for him, lost his nerve and turned and fled the field. And when the soldiers saw their king running, the whole vast army dissolved and ran with him. Alexander captured the Persian king's own camp, his tent, his treasure, and his family, his mother and his wife and his children, whom Alexander, in a famous gesture, treated with perfect courtesy and honour as royalty, which won him great fame for magnanimity. Instead of chasing the beaten king at once into the heart of the empire, Alexander turned south, down the coast, to secure the whole seaboard so that the Persian fleet would have no harbours left, and here he met his hardest fight, not a battle, but a siege, at the great island fortress city of Tyre, which stood off the coast behind mighty walls and refused to submit. For 7 months Alexander besieged it, building an enormous causeway out across the sea to reach the island, a stupendous feat of engineering under constant attack, and when at last the city fell his patience was exhausted and his vengeance was terrible. From the coast he passed on into Egypt, which had long chafed under Persian rule, and which welcomed him as a liberator, and the Egyptians hailed him as their pharaoh, and there on a strip of land between the sea and a lake, at the western edge of the Nile Delta, Alexander founded a city and gave it his own name, Alexandria, one of many cities he would found and name after himself across the world, but this one destined to become the greatest of them all, the shining capital of Greek learning for centuries to come. And from Egypt he made a strange and famous journey, striking out with a small party across the desert to a remote oasis where there was an ancient oracle, and what the oracle told him there he never fully revealed, but it seems to have confirmed in him a growing belief that he was no ordinary man, but the son of a god. A belief that would grow on him, for good and ill, through all the years that followed. Then at last he turned inland, into the heart of the empire, to seek out the Persian king and finish the war, and the two met for the last time on a wide dusty plain called Gaugamela, where the King of Kings had gathered the whole strength of his empire, an army so vast that it made Alexander's look like a raiding party, and had even levelled the ground so that his scythed chariots and his war elephants could charge freely. It should have been the end of Alexander. Instead, it was the end of the Persian Empire. By a brilliant and daring manoeuvre, drawing the Persian line out of position and then charging with his companions through the gap that opened, Alexander drove once again straight for the king, and once again the King of Kings lost his nerve and fled, and once again his army broke and ran, and this time there was no recovering. The capitals of the empire fell open before the conqueror, the great cities with their unimaginable treasures, gold beyond counting, the accumulated wealth of 200 years of empire, and in the ceremonial heart of Persia. In the magnificent palace city of the great kings, Alexander and his army feasted, and there, whether by drunken accident or cold calculation, the great palace was set ablaze and burned, the halls where Xerxes had planned the invasion of Greece going up in flames at last, 150 years late, and the empire that had once shot an arrow at the sky and sworn to remember the Athenians was ended by a Greek-speaking king from the north. The fleeing King of Kings did not long survive. Hunted across his own collapsing empire, he was murdered by his own despairing followers and left dying by the roadside, and Alexander, coming upon the body, is said to have covered it with his own cloak and ordered it buried with royal honour, and to have taken up from that moment. The title and the state of the King of Kings himself, the master now not only of Greece and Macedon, but of the whole vast inheritance of Persia. He might have stopped there. He had done what his father had dreamed of and far more, avenged the old invasions, freed the Greek cities of Asia, and conquered the greatest empire on earth, and he was still not yet 26 years old. But something in Alexander could not stop. Some restless fire, some need always for the next horizon, and instead of turning back to rule what he had won, he plunged on, ever eastward into the wild and mountainous far provinces of the old empire, into lands the Greeks had barely heard of, chasing down the last resistance, storming fortresses perched on impossible crags, marching his army across deserts and over snowbound passes, deeper and deeper into the unknown heart of Asia. And as he went, a change came over him that troubled his Macedonian soldiers deeply. He had set out as a Greek king leading Greeks against the barbarian, but the more of the Persian Empire he conquered, the more he seemed to become a Persian king himself, adopting the dress and the ceremony of the great kings he had overthrown, taking Persian nobles into his service and his friendship, marrying a princess of the eastern mountains, a woman named Roxana, said to be the most beautiful in all Asia, and beginning to expect his followers to bow down before him in the Persian manner, as men bowed before a god-king. To his blunt Macedonian veterans, free men who had marched beside him as companions and spoken their minds to his face, this was intolerable, this bowing and scraping, this dressing up in the robes of the enemy, and a bitterness grew between the king and the men who had won him his empire, a bitterness that more than once broke out into open quarrels, and worse. For Alexander in these years was becoming harder and more suspicious and more dangerous, drinking heavily, quick to see plots, and on more than one terrible occasion he turned on his own closest friends, and in one drunken feast, in a rage at a companion who had saved his life at the Granicus, but who now dared to mock him to his face for becoming a Persian, Alexander seized a spear and ran the man through and killed him on the spot, and then, when the madness passed and he saw what he had done, was flung into a grief so violent that his friends feared he would take his own life. He was a man being slowly consumed by his own greatness, worshipped as a god, master of the world, and less able to bear any word against him. And still he went on, over the mountains at the roof of the world, down at last into the green river valleys of India, into a land of strange gods and strange beasts, and there at a river swollen with the monsoon rains. He fought the last of his great battles against a mighty Indian king who met him with a line of war elephants, enormous armoured beasts the Macedonians had never faced in such numbers, that terrified the horses and trampled the men. Alexander crossed the flooded river by night in a storm, in one of the boldest strokes of his whole career, and after a long and bloody struggle he beat the elephants and the Indian king. But it cost him dearly, and when the defeated king was brought before him, wounded and proud, and Alexander asked how he wished to be treated, the king answered simply, like a king, and Alexander, admiring his courage, gave him back his kingdom to rule as a subordinate. And it was here, at the edge of India, having conquered further than any Greek had ever dreamed of going, that Alexander at last met the one thing he could not overcome, which was not an enemy, but his own men. For his soldiers had followed him for 8 years and many thousands of miles, and they were tired, worn out, far from home, and homesick beyond bearing. And when Alexander announced that they would press on still further, across yet another river, and into the vast unknown of the Indian plains toward the great encircling ocean he believed lay just beyond, they refused. For the first time his army would not follow him. They stood in the rain and the mud and would not move, and their spokesman told him gently that they had done enough, that a good commander knows when to stop, that they longed only to see their homes and their wives and their children again before they died, and Alexander pleaded and raged and shut himself in his tent for days. But the men would not yield, and in the end, for the only time in his life, Alexander turned back. There is a picture the ancient writers give us of Alexander in these days, gazing eastward at the world he would never conquer, and a later poet imagined him weeping because there were no more worlds to conquer. And though he did not truly say it, the phrase has stuck to him forever because it catches something true about the man. This hunger that no empire could fill, this reaching always for the horizon beyond the horizon. The very Greek fault, in the end, the overreaching pride that the wise old saying at Delphi had warned against, the forgetting that one is mortal. The turning back did not bring him peace. He led part of his army home through a terrible desert, a burning waste with no water, out of some last need to do what no one had done, and the desert nearly destroyed them, and thousands who had survived every battle died of thirst and heat in the sand, and Alexander, they say, when a little water was found, and brought to him in a helmet, poured it out onto the ground rather than drink while his men went dry. He came back at last to the heart of his empire, to the ancient city of Babylon on its wide brown river, master of the greatest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from Greece to the edge of India, and there he began to dream new dreams, of further conquests west and south, of great cities and mingled peoples, of fusing the Greek and the Persian worlds into one. But the dreams were never realized. In the early summer at Babylon, after a long night of feasting and drinking, Alexander fell ill with a fever, and the fever would not break, and day by day it deepened, and he grew weaker, until he could no longer speak, and his soldiers, frantic with grief and disbelief, filed past his bed one by one to look upon his face for the last time, and he could only move his eyes to acknowledge them. And then, not yet 33 years old, in the fullness of his glory, having conquered the world and never lost a battle, Alexander died. When he was asked, at the very end, so the story goes, to whom he left his empire, he answered only, to the strongest. And if he truly said it, it was a curse upon the world, for there was no strongest, only many strong, and the vast empire he had won by genius, and was held together by nothing but his own person, now had no person at its centre, and it began, almost before his body was cold, to tear itself apart. What followed Alexander's death was long and bloody and complicated, and we need not follow every twist of it, but the shape of it matters. His generals, the hard and capable men who had marched with him across the world, each with an army at his back, fell to fighting over the pieces, and for 40 years these wars of the successors dragged on, alliances forming and breaking, murders and betrayals. Alexander's own mother and wife and young son, all in the end killed off so that no heir of his blood should stand in the way. And when at last the dust settled, the single empire Alexander had won was gone forever, broken into several great kingdoms, each ruled by the descendants of one of his generals, each a Greek-speaking dynasty of foreign kings ruling over ancient eastern lands. One general's line took Egypt and ruled it from Alexander's shining new city of Alexandria for 300 years. A line of Greek pharaohs whose last and most famous ruler, many generations later, would be a queen who still means glamour and tragedy to us. The last of that Greek dynasty, who would tie the fate of Egypt to the rising power of Rome and die with the old world. Another general's line took the vast eastern heartland, the old Persian Empire from the coast of Asia deep into the east, and ruled it for a while as an enormous Greek-ruled kingdom stretching halfway to India. And Macedon itself and its uneasy grip on Greece went to a third line. This was the world we call Hellenistic, the world of the spread of Greekness, and it is a strange and important chapter, for although Alexander's political empire had shattered, his cultural conquest endured and even deepened. All across the enormous space he had crossed, from Egypt to the borders of India, he and his successors had planted Greek cities, dozens upon dozens of them, and into those cities came Greek settlers, soldiers and traders and administrators, bringing with them the Greek language, the Greek gods, the Greek gymnasium and theatre and marketplace, the whole apparatus of the Greek way of life, set down now in the middle of Egypt and Syria and Mesopotamia and the mountains of the Far East. And Greek became the common language of the whole Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, the language of government and trade and learning, spoken and written by educated people of every nation, from Italy to Afghanistan, so that a merchant or a scholar could travel across half the world and be understood everywhere in Greek. It was in this Greek-speaking Eastern world, some centuries later, that a new religion out of a small province would first spread and first write down its scriptures, and it wrote them in Greek, the common Greek of the Hellenistic world, which is why the sacred books of that faith came down to later ages in the language of Homer's distant children. The mingling went both ways. If the East became a little Greek, the Greeks who ruled it became, in their turn, more Eastern, more given to the worship of kings as gods, to vast wealth and luxury and courtly splendour, to a wider and more cosmopolitan sense of the world in which a man might think of himself less as the citizen of one small city and more as a citizen of the whole inhabited earth, a citizen of the cosmos, from which we get our word cosmopolitan, an idea the old city-states could never have produced. And the greatest monument of this age was not a battle or a kingdom, but that city in Egypt, Alexandria, which grew into the largest and richest and most brilliant city of the age, a huge cosmopolitan port of many peoples, with a great lighthouse rising from its harbour, one of the wonders of the world, its beacon guiding ships from far out at sea. And in Alexandria the Greek kings of Egypt founded an institution that gathered up and preserved and advanced the learning of the whole world, a great research institute and its famous library, which set out with royal money and a boundless ambition to collect every book that had ever been written, sending agents to buy up scrolls across the world, copying every book that came into the harbour until it held, they said, hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the accumulated knowledge of the human race gathered under one roof, where scholars from everywhere came to live and study and write, supported by the crown, in what was the nearest thing the ancient world ever made to a university. And out of that gathering of minds came a burst of science and scholarship as remarkable, in its own way, as the golden age of Athens had been in art and thought. Here a mathematician gathered up and set in order the whole of geometry, laying it out in a chain of logical proofs, building one upon another from a handful of simple starting points, in a book so perfect of its kind that it was used to teach the subject for more than 2,000 years, one of the most successful textbooks ever written. Here another, one of the very greatest minds of all antiquity, though he worked mostly in the Greek city of Syracuse in Sicily rather than in Alexandria itself, made discoveries in mathematics and mechanics that would not be equalled for nearly 2,000 years, worked out the principle of floating bodies while sitting in his bath, and so the story goes. Ran naked through the streets in his excitement, shouting that he had found it, devised machines and levers and pulleys, and, in the end, ingenious engines of war that held off a Roman siege of his city for years. And who died at last? An old man, killed by a Roman soldier while he was absorbed in a geometrical diagram drawn in the sand. His last words a request that the soldier not disturb his circles. Here a scholar who was chief librarian, with nothing but a stick, a shadow, and a piece of brilliant reasoning, measured the size of the whole round earth, for he had heard that at a certain town far to the south, the sun at noon on Midsummer Day shone straight down to the bottom of a well, casting no shadow. While on that same day in Alexandria a vertical stick did cast a short shadow, and from the length of that shadow and the distance between the two places, he calculated the circumference of the earth and got an answer astonishingly close to the truth. More than 2,000 years before anyone sailed around it to check, and here an astronomer dared to suggest, long before it could be proved, that the earth was not the fixed centre of everything, but that it and the other wandering stars circled the sun, a guess so far ahead of its time that it was set aside and half forgotten for 1,800 years, until at last another age was ready to hear it. This was the Hellenistic achievement, less famous than the Golden Age, but in some ways its equal, a great flowering of exact science and careful scholarship, spread across a Greek-speaking world that reached from the Nile to the edge of India, and it was, in its way, the fullest fruit of that Greek habit we watched, being born so long ago on the Ionian coast, the turning of a clear and patient reason upon the world in order to understand it. But this brilliant, wide, cosmopolitan Greek world, for all its wealth and learning, was politically weak, its great kingdoms forever at war with one another, wearing each other down just as the old city-states had done. And while they fought among themselves, far to the west, on the banks of a river in Italy, a new power had been quietly growing, a hard, disciplined, patient, and utterly relentless people, who would, in the space of a couple of centuries, swallow the whole Greek world, kingdom by kingdom, and inherit everything it had made. Before Rome comes, though, let us linger a little in that wide Hellenistic world, because it gave to us something quieter than the science of Alexandria and just as lasting, and it is a fitting thing to think about as sleep draws near. In the old days of the free city-states, a Greek had found the meaning of his life in the community, in being a citizen, in taking his place in the assembly and the army and the festivals of his own small city. But in the new world of vast kingdoms and distant god-kings, where the ordinary man had no share in the great decisions, and the old city was just one town among thousands in an empire, that old source of meaning had faded, and people began to ask a new and more private question. Not how should we govern the city, but how should I, one small person adrift in a vast and uncertain world, find peace? How should I live so as not to be tossed about by fear and desire and the blows of fortune? And out of that question grew new schools of philosophy, no longer chiefly concerned with the nature of the stars or the eternal forms, but with the art of living well, of finding tranquillity, and their answers have never lost their power to console. One school taught that the secret of happiness was to live simply and quietly, to withdraw from the anxious pursuit of wealth and power and fame, which only bring worry, and to find contentment instead in modest pleasures, in friendship, in a garden, in the absence of pain, and the calm of a mind freed from fear, above all from the fear of the gods and the fear of death, which they argued was nothing to us, since when we are, death is not, and when death is, we are not. Another and greater school taught something sterner, and to many, nobler, that the one thing truly in our power is not what happens to us, but how we meet it, that we cannot control fortune, cannot keep our loved ones from dying, or our bodies from failing, or the world from wounding us, but that we can always control our own judgments and our own will, and that the wise person therefore trains himself to want only what is in his power, to accept with calm what he cannot change, to do his duty, to master his passions, and to hold fast to virtue as the only true good, so that no loss and no pain and no tyrant can touch the citadel of a soul that has learned not to be disturbed. This philosophy, born in a colonnade in Athens and named for that porch, would in time cross the sea to Rome and become the guiding creed of some of the finest Roman minds, of statesmen and even of an emperor, and it speaks still, in our own restless and anxious age. To anyone lying awake in the dark trying to make peace with what cannot be changed. These were the last great gifts of Greek thought, these quiet philosophies of how to bear a human life, and they were being taught in the schools of Athens and Alexandria, even as the shadow of Rome fell across the whole Greek world. For Rome, that hard and patient city on its Italian river, had grown. In the centuries while the Greeks were busy with Alexander and his successors, from a small town into the master of Italy, and then, in a series of enormous and terrible wars, into the master of the whole western Mediterranean. And now, its power still swelling, it turned its gaze east, toward the rich and quarrelling Greek kingdoms. And the Greeks, as ever, could not unite against the danger. Some cities and kings even called the Romans in to help them against their Greek rivals, not understanding, until it was too late, that a power once invited never truly leaves. Kingdom by kingdom, war by war, the Romans advanced. They broke the army of Macedon and abolished its ancient monarchy. They humbled the great eastern kingdom of Alexander's successors and stripped it of its lands. And when the cities of the old Greek homeland made one last defiant stand, the Romans answered with a lesson in terror, for in the same year far away that they destroyed their great rival across the sea, they also fell upon the ancient and wealthy Greek city of Corinth, and they took it, and to teach the Greeks the price of resistance they destroyed it utterly, killing the men, selling the women and children into slavery, carrying off its art and its treasures to Rome, and leaving the site an empty ruin. The message was understood. Greece became, in the end, simply a province of the Roman Empire, governed from Rome, its long story of independence over at last, more than 1,000 years after the first city-states had risen out of the dark. And yet, and this is the strange and beautiful last turn of the whole tale, in conquering Greece, Rome was itself conquered. For the hard practical Romans, masters of war and law and engineering, stood in awe of the older and subtler culture they had overrun, and they fell in love with it, and they took it for their own. They learned the Greek language, and sent their sons to Athens to study philosophy, and filled their houses with Greek statues and their libraries with Greek books. They took the Greek gods and gave them Roman names and worshipped them as their own. They modelled their poetry and their architecture and their whole idea of what it meant to be civilized upon Greek examples. A Roman poet caught the truth of it in a single unforgettable line, that captive Greece had taken captive her fierce conqueror and brought the arts into rough Latium, and it was so. Everything the Greeks had made, the philosophy and the science, the poetry and the drama, the architecture and the sculpture, the history and the mathematics, all of it passed now into the keeping of Rome, and Rome carried it across the whole of the Western world, from Britain to the Euphrates, and wove it into the very foundations of Western civilization, so deeply that when the Roman Empire itself at last fell, and the long centuries of forgetting came, the memory of Greece never entirely died, but waited in a few monasteries and in the libraries of the East, to be rediscovered and rekindled again and again, in age after age, whenever people grew hungry once more for beauty and for reason and for freedom, until it reached, at the last, all the way down the long river of time to us, lying here in the dark, the distant airs of those little cities on their stony hills above the wine-dark sea. For that is the last and largest truth of this whole long story, and it is worth letting it settle over you slowly, like a warm blanket, as the night deepens. Ancient Greece as a political thing is long gone. Its cities are ruins now, its temples roofless, its language changed almost past recognizing, its gods worshipped nowhere. And yet in another and deeper sense it never ended at all. Because so much of how we think, and how we build, and how we argue, and how we govern ourselves, and even the words we use to do all these things, came from those few small cities in those few short centuries. and lives on inside us so completely that we no longer notice it, the way you no longer notice the language you dream in. Consider only a handful of the things they left. They left us the very idea of democracy, the notion, so ordinary to us now and so astonishing when it first appeared, that ordinary people are fit to rule themselves, that power should rest with the many and not the one, that a citizen is not a subject who obeys, but a member who decides. And though their democracy was narrow and flawed and lasted only a while, the idea itself never died, and every parliament and every free election in the world today is, in a distant way, an echo of those citizens gathering on the hillside above Athens to raise their hands and choose. They left us philosophy, the whole enterprise of thinking hard and honestly about the deepest questions, about what is real and what we can know and how we ought to live. And the questions those three Athenians asked in the marketplace are still, at bottom, the questions we ask, and to study philosophy at all, anywhere in the world, is still in large part to enter into a long conversation that they began. They left us science, or at least its first seeds, the revolutionary idea that the world can be understood by reason and observation rather than by myth, that behind the confusion of things there are laws and causes we can discover if we look and think clearly enough, and though it slept for long ages it woke again, and everything we know of the atom and the star and the living cell grows ultimately from that first Greek daring to ask what the world is made of and to seek the answer in the world itself. They left us history, the attempt to know our own past truly, by gathering evidence and weighing it, rather than by simply repeating comforting tales. They gave us the theatre, the tragedy and the comedy, the very idea of sitting together in the dark to watch a story acted out and to be moved and troubled and enlarged by it, so that every play and every film that has ever made you weep or laugh descends in an unbroken line from those festivals on the Athenian hillside. They gave us an ideal of beauty in art and building, of balance and proportion and grace, that has been returned to again and again for 2,000 years, so that the columns of the Parthenon are echoed in courthouses and banks and libraries and parliament buildings in cities all over the world, in places the Greeks never dreamed existed. And you have almost certainly stood before such columns yourself, without thinking of the little marble temple on the sacred rock from which they all descend. They gave us the Olympic Games, which after 1,500 years of silence were kindled again in modern times, and now gather the whole world every 4 years, still in the name of that quiet valley in the Peloponnese, still with a flame carried from Olympia. They gave us a great part of our very language, for the words we reach for whenever we speak of thought or feeling or knowledge are very often Greek at the root. Democracy and philosophy and history and theatre and music and mathematics and physics and biology and psychology and grammar and rhythm and harmony and drama and comedy and tragedy and idea and problem and method and system and crisis and character and energy and atom and cosmos, all of them Greek, so that we cannot even talk about our own minds and our own world without borrowing the words of those long-dead islanders and hill farmers. And they gave us, perhaps above all, a spirit, a way of facing the world, curious and questioning and unwilling to simply accept. That refusal to leave anything unexamined, that faith that the human mind, looking clearly and reasoning honestly, can understand things and make things and govern things, and need not simply bow down before power or tradition or fear. It is a spirit that has often been betrayed and often been lost and often been dangerous, for the same restless reaching that built the Parthenon also burned Persepolis and wept for more worlds to conquer. And the Greeks themselves, for all their genius, could not govern their own passions, or keep the peace among themselves, or extend their glorious freedom to the women and the slaves and the strangers in their midst. They were not better than us, and in many ways they were harder and crueler than we would wish to be. But they were awake, gloriously and dangerously awake, and they woke something in the human story that has never gone back to sleep, and we are still, all of us, whether we know it or not, living in the long afternoon of what those small quarrelsome cities began. And so the ruins on the hilltop and not really dead stones at all. They are more like seeds, scattered so long ago, and grown now into a forest so vast and so familiar that we walk about beneath its branches and take its shade for the ordinary sky. The Gothard on the hillside where we began, sitting among the fallen marble without a thought for it, carries the whole inheritance inside him even so, in the shape of his letters, if he can read, in the games his children play, in the very way he might, on some restless night, lie awake and wonder about the nature of things. It is all still here. It never left. History in the end does not really disappear. It only sinks down out of sight and becomes the ground beneath our feet, the soil we are rooted in, so deep and so constant that we forget it is there at all, and walk upon it, and build upon it, and fall asleep upon it, night after night, without ever knowing how much of who we are was planted, long ago, on a few stony hills above a wine-dark sea, by a people who have been dust for 2,000 years and are with us still. So let us walk back through the whole of it now, very slowly, very gently, the way you might walk back through the rooms of a great house at the end of a long day, turning down the lamps one by one, not to study anything any more, only to let it all pass by once more before you sleep. Let it drift. There is nothing to hold on to now, nothing to remember, nothing you need to keep. Just let the long story move softly through your mind like a slow river carrying leaves. Far back at the beginning there was the long green island of Crete, and the open, unwalled palaces with their red columns and their painted dolphins, and the slim young acrobats leaping over the horns of the bulls, and the ladies with their curled black hair laughing at some festival that ended 3,500 years ago, and the great jars of oil standing in the cool storerooms, and the sea all around, calm and blue and full of ships, and no one afraid, for a very long and sunlit while. And then the harder people on the mainland, in their grey fortresses of enormous stones, with their golden masks and their love of war and their bronze swords. The lords of Mycenae looking out over the plain, and the poets singing in their halls of heroes and of a war at a windy city across the sea. And then the fires, one after another, and the long forgetting, the 400 quiet years when the writing was lost and the world grew small, and the singers kept the old stories alive in the dark, passing them mouth to mouth around the fires until at last, with a new alphabet, they could be written down, and the blind poet's two great songs stood at the head of everything that came after. And then the slow waking, the little cities rising on their hills, each with its high rock and its open marketplace, each fiercely its own, scattered like frogs around the great pond of the sea, sending out their ships to found new cities on far coasts, gathering every 4 years at the quiet valley of Olympia to run and wrestle for a wreath of wild olive under a sacred truce. And the two great cities so unlike each other, the one that made itself into a nation of silent iron soldiers eating their black broth in the common mess, and the other that step by step gave its ordinary people the power to rule themselves, and called it democracy, and changed the world. And then the great shadow from the east, the largest empire on earth pouring across the water, and the free men running at the enemy across the plain of Marathon, and the 300 combing their long hair in the narrow pass before they died, and the wooden walls of Athens fighting in the strait while the city burned, and the great fleet of the King of Kings shattered in the narrows under his own astonished eyes, and Greece, against all the odds, still free. And out of that survival the golden noon, the white temple rising on the sacred rock, bent everywhere so that it might look straight, the marble figures caught forever in the middle of an easy breath. The whole city gathered on the hillside to weep over the sufferings of the heroes and to laugh at the mockery of its own leaders, the father of history setting down his inquiries, the ugly barefoot old man in the marketplace asking his endless gentle questions until the tired and frightened city gave him the cup of hemlock and made him immortal. And then the long ruinous war between the two great cities, the plague in the crowded streets, the doomed armada sailing away to the west in the summer sun and never coming home, and the walls of Athens pulled down to the sound of flutes, and the golden age over, and the tired century that followed, the cities wearing themselves out in pointless wars while their greatest minds turned inwards to the deepest questions, the pupil of the hemlock drinker dreaming of a perfect world beyond the shadows, and his pupil in turn setting out to know everything there was to know. And the rough kingdom in the north that the polished southerners despised, and the cunning king who forged the phalanx and mastered Greece, and his restless golden son sleeping with the poem of the old war beneath his pillow, taming the wild horse by turning it to face the sun, crossing to Asia and throwing his spear into the shore, cutting through the empire of Persia in 3 great battles, burning the palace of the great kings 150 years too late, marching on and on past every horizon into the far mountains and down into India, until his own weary men would go no further, and he turned back at last and poured the water into the sand, and died young at Babylon, with the whole world in his hands, and no one to leave it to but the strongest. And the long bloody breaking of his empire into the Greek ruled kingdoms of the East, and the spread of the Greek tongue and the Greek city from the Nile to the edge of India, and the great library at Alexandria gathering all the knowledge of the world, where a man measured the round earth with a stick and a shadow, and another ran naked from his bath shouting that he had found it, and another guessed that the earth goes round the sun 18 centuries too soon, and the quiet philosophies of how to bear a human life, the garden and the porch, teaching men to want only what is in their power and to make peace with all the rest. And then the hard patient city from the west, swallowing the Greek world kingdom by kingdom, destroying Corinth to teach the lesson. And then, in the very moment of conquest, falling in love with the older and subtler world it had overrun, and taking all of it for its own, and carrying it across the whole of the West and down all the ages, so that captive Greece took captive her fierce conqueror after all, and the seeds scattered on those few stony hills grew at last into the forest, under whose branches we are still living, and dreaming. Tonight, let all of it drift now, the islands and the ships and the temples and the battles and the philosophers and the young king weeping for more worlds. Let it all grow soft and far away and dim, like a story told to you when you were very small, that you do not need to follow any more, that is only a warmth and a murmur now at the edge of sleep. And now, before you go, let us return one last time to that hillside above the sea where we started, and simply rest there for a little while, and let the night come down. The honey light is long gone now. The sun has slipped down behind the far islands, and the sea has turned from wine dark to slate, to a deep and shining silver as the first stars come out, and the air has cooled and grown soft, and the wild thyme still gives up its scent underfoot, sweeter somehow in the dark. The goatherd has gone home, the fishing boat is drawn up on the shingle with its sail furled, and the little lamps have been lit in the windows of the small white houses down in the folds of the land. Warm amber points of light scattered across the darkening hills, each one a family gathering in for the night, just as families have gathered in on these hills for 4,000 years, through all the ages we have travelled tonight, through the Bronze Age and the Long Dark and the Golden Noon and the coming of Rome, and everything since. The fallen marble on the hilltop is only a pale glimmer now in the starlight, cool and silent, keeping its long patience as it has kept it through so many nights. A little wind moves through the dry grass and the olive leaves turn their silver undersides to the moon, and far below the sea breathes in and out against the stones of the shore, in and out, the same slow breathing it has kept since long before the first ship ever crossed it, and will keep long after the last of us is gone. There is such peace in it. All the great struggles we have followed tonight, the raids and the wars, the burning cities and the drowned fleets, the arguments in the marketplace and the young king reaching for the ends of the earth, all of it has grown quiet now. All of it has sunk down into the calm dark ground beneath these hills, and become part of the stillness, part of the warm night, part of the sound of the sea, and you have no need to hold any of it. You have followed the whole long story, from the very first palaces to the death of the young conqueror and beyond, and now you can set it all gently down, the way you set down a book you have finished, and let it rest on the table beside you in the dark, and close your eyes. There is nothing left to do tonight. There is nowhere you need to be. The lamp is dim, and the night is deep, and the sea is breathing slowly against the shore, and all the old bright world we walked through together has settled into a soft and distant warmth at the edge of your mind, asking nothing of you, only keeping you company as you drift. Let your breath grow slow and even, like the sea. Let the last small weight of the day slip away. Let your thoughts loosen and grow soft and wander wherever they wish to go, out over the dark water, up among the quiet stars. There is all the time in the world. Are you still awake? If you are, even a little, then know that there is another story already waiting for you, another quiet journey through some other corner of the past, resting on the screen for whenever you would like it, so that you never have to lie alone in the dark for long. And if these slow wanderings through history help you find your rest, you might, only if you truly wish to, leave a gentle like and follow along, so that the next one can make its way to you on some other sleepless night, and so that other tired and restless people, lying awake in the dark just as you are, in 100 different countries and 100 different midnights, can find their way to this quiet corner too. But none of that matters now. All that matters now is that you are warm, and you are safe, and the day is over, and you have nothing left to carry. So let it all go. Let the hillside fade, and the sea fade, and the stars fade, and the sound of these words fade, softer and softer, until there is nothing left but the dark and the quiet and the slow, gentle rhythm of your own breathing, carrying you down, very slowly, very slowly, very slowly, into sleep. Rest now. You have travelled a long way tonight, all the way across 2,000 years and back again, and you have earned this stillness. Close your eyes and let the old world keep watch over you as it has kept watch over so many sleepers before you through so many long and peaceful nights. Good night, sleep well, and sweet, sweet dreams.